Hello, my dear students. Welcome back to our second digital lecture in the field of energy, environment, and sustainability. Today, we will continue what we started with last week, namely thinking more thoroughly about sustainability and what sustainability is, how sustainability refers to sustainable development, what sustainable development is, and therefore we will start looking deeply and in a connected way into the sustainability goals of the United Nations, and from there we will start to move into the specific areas of sustainability, starting with energy sustainability. So welcome back, everybody. I hope we will have a good time from the distance. Here we can basically already see the idea, the planet Earth being surrounded by green nature, green being the color of the environment, of a healthy environment, and therefore the notion shall be transferred that there is also a healthy planet Earth for us human beings to live on. And that is what I chose for the motto. Our two lectures now, Rethinking Sustainability. And as I said, we come today from sustainable development to the various sustainability areas. And of course, the whole planet Earth is affected by issues of sustainability, of environment. But it's not only the environment in the narrow sense. And that is something we will learn today when we look into the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN. So let's talk about the Sustainable Development Goals and a little bit also about the history behind it. The 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, adopted by all United Nations member states in 2015, provides a common blueprint for peace and prosperity for the people and for the planet as a whole. So that is meant for now, and that is also meant in particular for the future. So when they signed it in 2015, they made a 15 years agenda to be attained by 2030. So with 2020, we have gone a third of the whole way, and therefore it might be interesting, of course, to see how far we have already gone. So we will look into the goals. Why are they necessary? What are they about? What is the numbers behind them? What is the concrete sub-goals, so to say, the concrete steps to be attained, and also what is the current status of it. At its heart of this agenda for sustainable development, we have 17 sustainable development goals. Often they are abbreviated with the initial letters SDG. So when you read SDG, or SDGs with a small s to announce the plural, you basically will see that it's about those 17 goals. And these sustainable development goals may also be regarded as an urgent call for action by all countries. So everybody from developed countries to countries which are in the process of developing in various degrees at various stages are called to action, and the best thing how it would work would be in a global form of cooperation, a global partnership of sustainability, because many of the problems, as we will see, are not reduced to national borders, but they are cross-border problems, international problems, and they of course have the histories. There can be histories of inequality, etc. And we will see that inequality between the states, but also within the states, is one of the goals. Being, let's say, the goal is to reduce that type of inequality, etc. So they recognize that ending poverty and other deprivations must go hand in hand with strategies that improve, for example, health or education, reduce, as I just mentioned, the inequality between people, between countries, between social levels, etc., and spur economic growth. So those 17 goals are nothing to just look at in an isolated way, and particularly not work on that in an isolated way, but we have to really see how make those goals interact, make the measures interact, and be aware of the interaction of the interdependencies between these goals. So all, of course, these things while tackling the major issues like climate change and working to preserve oceans, working to preserve our forests, etc. So the marine life as well as the life on land masses are very important. The SDGs built on decades of work already done by countries and the United Nations, including in particular the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs. When we look back in the early 1990s, actually it was in the year 1992, at the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, nearly all of the countries, so more than 178 countries, as a matter of fact, adopted the Agenda 21, which was a comprehensive plan of action to build a global partnership for sustainable development, to improve human lives on the one hand, and to protect the environment on the other. Member states later anonymously adopted the Millennium Declaration at the Millennium Summit, as it was called, in September 2000 at the United Nations headquarters in New York City in the US. The summit led to the elaboration of 8 Millennium Development Goals at that time to reduce extreme poverty by 2015. A little bit later, 2 years later, the Johannesburg Declaration on Sustainable Development and the plan of implementation occurred. So that was adopted at the World Summit on Sustainable Development in South Africa in 2002. It reaffirmed the global community's commitments to poverty eradication and the environment, and built also on the Agenda 21 and the Millennium Declaration by including more emphasis on multilateral partnerships. So that idea of cooperation and the need to cooperate to address those mega issues which affect basically all countries and all individuals, all human beings on Earth, that the awareness that can only be attained when everybody is standing close to each other. At the UN Conference on Sustainable Development in Rio de Janeiro in June 2012, so 20 years later, 20 years after the original Rio de Janeiro summit, and that's why it is called the Rio Plus 20, member states adopted the outcome document, which was named The Future We Want, in which they decided, amongst other things, to launch a process to develop a set of sustainable development goals, so the SDGs we know today, which were to be built upon the Millennium Development Goals, so which were less in number, the MDGs, and to establish the UN High-Level Political Forum on Sustainable Development. The Rio Plus 20 outcome also contained other measures for implementing sustainable development, including, for example, mandates for future programs of work in development financing, small island developing states, and so on and so forth. Then, when we go a little bit further in time, in 2013, the General Assembly of the UN set up a 30-member open working group to develop a proposal on the SDGs, so what they were to look like exactly, etc. And then 2 years later again in 2015, early 2015, the General Assembly began the negotiation process on the post-2015 development agenda. The process culminated then in the subsequent adoption of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which is the one we are talking about now, with the 17 SDGs at its core at the UN Sustainable Development Summit in September 2015. That is when that happened. So 2015 therefore was also a landmark year for cooperation, for multilateralism and international policy shaping, with the adoption of several major agreements. And I will give you a little oversight of them. So for example, we had the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction in March 2015. Then later in July of that same year, we had the Addis Ababa Action Agenda of Financing for Development. We had in September 2015 at the UN Sustainable Development Summit in New York, the Transforming Our World 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. That was the one where the 17 SDGs were adopted. And then also the Paris Agreement on Climate Change in December 2015. So now the annual high-level political forum on sustainable development serves as the central UN platform for the follow-up and the review of the SDGs. Today, the Division for Sustainable Development Goals, the DSDG, in the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs, so the UNDESA, UNDESA, provides substantive support and also capacity building for the social development goals and their related thematic issues, meaning water, energy, climate, oceans, urbanization, transport, infrastructure, science, technology, etc. So we can see, for example, the Global Sustainable Development Report. You can see partnerships in small island developing states, etc. So that's all part of that package. The DSDG does play a key role in the evaluation of UN system-wide implementation of the 2030 Agenda and on advocacy and outreach activities relating to those development goals. In order to make this 2030 Agenda not stay just humble, noble words, but one day, inshallah, become a reality, broad ownership of the SDGs must translate into a strong commitment by everybody involved, by all stakeholders, to implement the goals. And DSDG basically aims to help facilitate this engagement. This slide is a little introduction. I embedded a short video clip by the United Nations on the Sustainable Development Goals, and it's named "Do You Know the 17 Sustainable Development Goals?" And if you were in real class now, I would ask you about them and try to develop them together. So if you didn't know them already, I would ask you just think about what could be them, and we would use the whiteboard and systematize them, etc. And finally, I'm pretty sure that pretty quickly we would end up with all those important issues, with all those goals. Since we are not sitting together, unfortunately, right now, I'd like to ask you to just watch that little video, and in a brief 2 minutes way, they will be just shown to you by name. A little bit of inspiration maybe to my more detailed explanations of what they are, what they mean, and so on, which are to follow. So now, having seen the video, you can now have an overview here of all those 17 goals. First one is eradicating poverty, second one is eradicating hunger, the other one is attaining good health and well-being for everybody around the globe. Fourth one, quality education for everyone, also lifelong learning. Then attaining gender equality, getting clean water and sanitation to the people, making possible affordable and clean energy, then decent economic growth combined with decent work for everybody. And ninth one, industry, innovation, infrastructure. Then 10, reduced inequalities between the countries, but also within the countries, between the people. 11, the notion of sustainable cities and communities. 12th goal, responsible consumption and production, also going into the direction of economics, corporations, businesses. Then climate action, of course, fighting against climate change. And then the marine life and the life on the land masses on the planet Earth, above the water. And then the more institutional core political science goals, peace, justice, and strong institutions, and the idea of a partnership to attain all the goals together in cooperation. So that was the overview, and now we will look in detail into each of these goals. When we take a look at the slide, we see figures, graphs, etc. provided by the United Nations. And the main message here is that the world is not on track to end poverty by 2030. So even if the number obviously is about to decrease, there will still be a significant number, or is expected to be there by the end of the 2020, so when we head into 2030. Another figure on the left-hand side is that 55% of the world's population which have no access to social protection, so if anything happens to them, they are on their own. They have to try to survive however possible with the help of their families whatsoever, but there is no institutional network, no type, not even a small type of welfare system for them. And when we look on the right-hand graph, we can see that the statement that more than 700 million, so exactly 736 million people lived in extreme poverty in the year when these Sustainable Development Goals were decided upon 400, out of which 430 million alone in Sub-Saharan Africa. So it shows, alone these numbers show there is a tremendous need, and when we look deeper into the situation, we can say now that more than those 700 million people, which is roughly 10% of the world population, still live in extreme poverty, and they are struggling. Those people are struggling to fulfill even the most basic needs of human beings, like health, like education, like access to water, access to sanitation, to name only a few. The majority of people living on less than $1.90 a day. That is not a lot. $1.90. That's not even a coffee you can get in the U.S. A day live in Sub-Saharan Africa. So worldwide, the poverty rate in rural areas, for example, is over 17%. So that's more than 3 times than in urban areas. Also, when you have a job, that does not guarantee automatically a decent living. So when we take a closer look here, 8% of employed workers and their families around the world lived in extreme poverty in 2018. So 8% of the people who were having a job, who were working, they still were forced to live in extreme poverty. Poverty has effects. It affects children disproportionately. 1 out of 5 children lives in extreme poverty, and ensuring social protection for all children and other vulnerable groups would be critical to reduce that poverty. When we think about poverty per se, we can find a number of dimensions. So we see it causes, we see that its causes include unemployment, social exclusion, high vulnerability of certain populations to disasters, for example, to diseases. We see that currently during the corona outbreak that within even richer countries, we can see that the homeless, for example, are disproportionately affected because they have no place to go to hide from the virus, for example. Or also poor countries are disproportionately affected. For example, yesterday in the newspaper there was an article about countries in sub-Saharan Africa, and they said the virus is affecting us, but the poverty is the thing which kills us, basically. So we can see all those effects taking place here. Also, when we look to disasters, often the houses of poor people in the unprivileged areas of cities, they are built in a cheap way, and when there is an earthquake, they all get hit particularly hard. They all collapse, while the houses often of wealthier people are built with concrete or with stones, so they in many cases survive. And even if not, there is still money for them. They can rebuild their stuff quickly, while others may be living then without housing for months or years. That can happen in wealthy countries as well. So just look at the situation of Hurricane Katrina in the United States, in the South, in the city of New Orleans, Louisiana, etc. So also growing inequality is detrimental to economic growth and undermines social cohesion, increasing political and social tensions, again leading to a destabilization of society as a whole. And we come back to what we were talking about in the beginning, the security development nexus, the negative way of how societies get affected with respect to security and underdevelopment and so on. So therefore we can see maybe even a instability increase and increasing conflicts and so on and so forth. What are the specific targets then of the social development goal number 1 here? So first one is by 2030 to eradicate extreme poverty for all people everywhere, and that is currently measured when people are living on less than $1.25 a day. That is called or taken as a measurement for extreme poverty, and that is what the goal shall change. Another element of this goal is also by 2030 reduce at least by half the proportion of men, women and children of all ages living in poverty in all its dimensions according to the various national definitions. So really try to get everybody out of it, from the small baby to the grandfather, great-grandfather, and the great-grandmother and beyond. So really everybody shall get into a position to live a far more decent life than up to now. Also, the implementation of nationally appropriate social protection systems and measures for all, including particular floors like a safety net, and also to achieve substantial coverage of the poor and the vulnerable through social systems, through welfare systems, protection systems, at least offering a minimum of protection and not leave the people out in the rain, so to say, without any protection, as we can see it now in many countries. So that's another goal. Also to ensure that all men and women, in particular of course the poor and vulnerable, have equal rights to economic resources as well as access to basic services, to ownership, to control over land or other forms of property, to inheritance, to natural resources, to appropriate new technology and financial service. And that often means microfinance, of course. Another aspect of that is to build by 2030 the resilience of the poor and those in vulnerable situations, and therefore to reduce their exposure and vulnerability, for example, to climate-related extreme events. And there we can already see the other Millennium Goal, which I mentioned just in the overview, the climate issue. So we have to address the climate issue in order to also attain the issue of poverty reduction. So they are interrelated, and the more we go into those issues and through those issues, we will see how they stick together. And it's not only climate-related extreme events, but also, of course, economic, social, environmental shocks and disasters, which normally hit the less privileged disproportionately, stronger and harder. So in terms of significant mobilization of resources from a variety of sources, including through enhanced development cooperation between wealthier countries and developing countries, less and least developed countries, in order to provide adequate and predictable means for developing countries, in particular least developed countries, in order to implement programs and policies to end poverty in all its dimensions. So that's also something included in that package. And of course, the idea, the aim to create sound policy frameworks at various levels, the national level, the regional level, also of course international levels, based on pro-poor and gender-sensitive development strategies to support accelerated investment in poverty eradication actions. Poverty, or the idea of erasing poverty, of course, is a very good and a necessary starting point. But of course, we have to move on, and closely related to that issue of poverty is the issue of hunger, of starvation. And that leads us to the second goal now, to end hunger and achieve food security. So in the beginning, in our first lecture, if you remember, I tried to make clear the close relationship between sustainability and security. Of course, we were talking about the development security nexus, the one I already mentioned just a minute ago in the description and the explanation of the first goal, but food security being a element of an enlarged security conception, we can see it here as a sustainability goal at the same time. And when we look at the numbers, there are millions of people living in hunger, 821 million undernourished in the year 2017. And that was a number that even went up from the number in 2015, where it was, in thick inverted commas, only 784 million. So here we are moving away from the goals the closer we get to 2030. 2/3 of extremely poor employed workers worldwide are agricultural workers. So again, we see poverty reduction going hand in hand also with that goal, which could help increase the situation, improve the situation for people. 2/3 of undernourished people worldwide live in two regions, namely Sub-Saharan Africa, which is not really surprising, but also Southern Asia. So we can see two key regions offering or needing our particular assistance. So in general, we can say that it's a high time to rethink how we grow, share, and consume our food. And that is, of course, food security, but that's also nutrition security, agricultural security, and so on. So if done right, agriculture, forestry, also fisheries can provide nutritious food for all and generate decent incomes while supporting people-centered rural development and protecting the environment. So again, you see 2, 3 other goals are already affected here. We talk about, if done right, agriculture, forestry, and fisheries can provide nutritious food, but of course that means overfishing or burning down the rainforest, etc., are certainly not the solution to the problem, but they increase the problems, make it even worse and worse. Also, when we talk about it, or when we think about it, the bringing down of more and more rainforests, etc., also increases, and that is a footnote to the current situation, increases, for example, the likelihood of severe viruses spreading because the reduced biosphere, so to say, and the closer contact of human beings with creatures from the rainforest, etc., which normally stay among themselves, etc., is one of the factors that led, for example, to some of the Ebola outbreaks and so on. So something we also have to keep in the back of our mind. There are a lot of unintended implications and effects when the environment is brought down, so to say, and also when we look underwater, the destruction of reefs, the overfishing, etc. So you can see everything is somehow sticking together, and we cannot just turn the knobs here and then don't think something else happens. And on the other hand, we have to put positive measures out there in order to get the interrelations at the same time into a better direction. So right now, when we look at it, our soils, freshwater, oceans, forests, and biodiversity are being rapidly degraded. So we have to keep that in mind. It's a fact that there is a lot of negative things happening which have a very bad impact on the way how we live now and in the future. Climate change is putting even more pressure on the resources we depend on, increasing risks associated with disasters, such as droughts, such as floods. So both no water or just too much water. Many rural women and men can no longer make ends meet on their land, forcing them to migrate to cities in search of opportunities, for example, but not only into cities, maybe also across borders, etc. So we already have the term climate refugees, which is an increasing number of people who, because their foundations of living, the foundations of making agriculture, are completely destroyed by increasing temperatures, etc., we can see they have to move. They have to move to other places, and there are already people, and they are already often in need of support. So that is something on the medium term at least, but maybe already on a shorter distance, will cause a lot of problems within the regions, within, for example, Sub-Saharan Africa, but also then for the countries on the margins, on the fringes, like North Africa, particularly with people trying to get into Europe, for example. So we can see, again, the security aspect of that. One of the security aspects of it, poor food security, is of course causing millions of children to be stunted or too short for the ages due to severe malnutrition. So again, sustainability and security are closely intertwined there. A profound change of the global food and agriculture system is needed if we are to nourish the 100+ million people who are really, really hungry today, and the additional 2 billion people expected to be undernourished by 2050. So as I said, the number is going up, and also the demographic number is increasing, particularly in countries like China, India, etc. We can see tremendous growth rates also in other parts of the world. And the question really is, what effects does that have for the possibility to nourish the people and nourish them in a good way? And of course also with respect to living close together, increasing the likelihood of diseases and the spread of diseases, etc. So that is something which also needs to be addressed. But let's stay with that. Investments in agriculture are crucial to increasing the capacity for agricultural productivity, and sustainable food production systems are necessary to help alleviate the perils of hunger. So yeah, the current situation, I said it, estimated 821 million people undernourished in 2017. The majority of the world's hungry people live in developing countries, where 12.9% of the population is undernourished. Sub-Saharan Africa remains the region with the highest prevalence of hunger, with the rate increasing from 20.7% in 2014 to 23.2% in 2017. So that means nearly a fourth of the population there is in severe hunger. In sub-Saharan Africa, the number of undernourished people increased from 195 million in 2014 to 237 million in 2017. So that's real frightening numbers. And we talk about million, but that means we have 237 individual destinies, people with feelings, with families whatsoever. So that is really a big disaster, and it is absolutely necessary to address it. So it's completely understandable that the United Nations put it on the agenda, but we still have to see if this agenda here can be turned into reality. At the moment, the situation looks pretty dark. Poor nutrition causes nearly half of death in children under 5. So 3.1 million children each year die because of poor nutrition. That's also a very sad number. And 149 million children under 5 years of age, and that means roughly a fourth of the global under 5 population, were still chronically undernourished in 2018. At the same time, we see that agriculture is the single largest employer in the world, providing livelihoods for 40% of today's global population. It's the largest source of income and jobs for poor rural households. That does not necessarily mean that that there are high incomes coming with it, but at least most of the people are employed there. We can see that there are about 500 million small farms worldwide, most still rain-fed, providing up to 80% of the food consumed in a large part of the developing world. Investing in smallholder women and men is an important way, therefore, to increase food security and provide nutrition for the poorest, as well as for food production for local and even global markets, which then would be another aspect of the development goals, the increase of income from trade, from industry, and so on. Since the 1900s, about 75% of crop diversity has been lost from farmers' fields. Better use of agricultural biodiversity could contribute to more nutritious diets, could also help enhance livelihoods for farming communities, and also would provide for more resilient and sustainable farming systems. So that is something in the agricultural industry that needs to be addressed rather sooner than later. If women farmers had the same access to resources as men, it was found out the number of hungry in the world could be reduced up to 150 million. It's also an interesting aspect. And another point is that about 840 million people have no access to electricity worldwide, and most of them live in rural areas of the developing world. And one also found out that energy poverty in many regions of the world also is a very important, a very fundamental barrier to reducing hunger and ensuring that the world can produce enough food to meet future demands. So that's another access point, so to say, where international cooperation must be targeted and provide for more energy to improve agriculture and so on. Let us take a look at the specific targets of that development goal. By 2030, hunger should be ended and access by all people, in particular the poor people in vulnerable situations, guaranteed. And that includes, of course, infants. So the idea is to provide safe, nutritious, and sufficient food for everybody all year round. Along with that comes the goal, comes the aim to end all forms of malnutrition, including achieving already by 2025, so in 5 years' time, the internationally agreed targets on stunting and wasting in children under 5 years of age, and address the nutritional needs of adolescent girls, pregnant and lactating women, and older persons. For that, the aim is to double the agricultural productivity and incomes of small-scale food producers by 2030. That means, in particular, women. That also includes indigenous peoples, family farmers, pastoralists, fishers, small fishers, including through secure and equal access to land. So that's again a political issue, the land distribution, maybe land ownership only by rich people whatsoever. So maybe there is the need for redistribution processes of lands, etc. So that's highly sensitive issues in many countries. Also access to other productive resources and inputs, to knowledge, also very important, financial services, microcredits, etc. Also access to markets, fair market access, opportunities for value addition, and maybe also for non-farm employment. Furthermore, what is needed or what is tried to be attained by 2030 is a sustainable food production system, or let's say sustainable food production systems around the world, implementation of resilient agricultural practices that can increase the productivity and production, that help, at the other hand, to maintain ecosystems, so be economically and ecologically efficient, strengthening of capacity for adoption to climate change, so that the agriculture does not feed even the climate change, make it more faster, and so on. Dealing with extreme weather, drought, flooding, and other disasters, and progressively improve land and soil quality. Now that's also something to be attained, and a very, very big challenge indeed. Also, a goal which already should have been attained by now, by 2020, is the maintenance of genetic diversity of seeds, of cultivated plants and farmed and domesticated animals, and their related wild species, including through soundly managed and diversified seed and plant banks at the national, regional, and international levels, and promote also access to and fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from the utilization of genetic resources and associated traditional knowledge as international agreed. So today we still often have the fact that farmers have to buy seeds from year to year because they are genetically manipulated in a way that you cannot reuse them, so that large corporations, international corporations, have a guarantee of steady profit raising. So that is something which needs to be addressed, and priorities have to be made there. Also increased investment, including through enhanced international cooperation in rural infrastructure, agricultural research and extension services, technology development, and plant and livestock gene banks in order to enhance agricultural productive capacity in developing countries, in particular in the least developed countries. Also the correction and prevention of trade restrictions and distortions in world agricultural markets, including through the parallel elimination of all forms of agricultural export subsidies and all export measures with equivalent effect in accordance with the mandate of the Doha development round. And finally, in that respect, the adoption of measures to ensure the proper functioning of food commodity markets and their derivatives and facilitate timely access to market information, including on food reserves, in order to help limit extreme food price volatility. That is another very big issue, the fact that food or food resources are also traded at specific stock markets. They can make money on those issues, and at the same time that makes the prices go up, and that has a negative effect on food production, for example. That makes poor farmers lose money or get out of business, and then there is not enough food, and only you have winners maybe in Chicago at the stock market who is very happy that the price for sugar or wheat or whatsoever went up tremendously, but at the same time people are starving because of that. And this is one of the distortions, if I want to make it in inverted commas, which definitely need to be addressed, and that is therefore on the agenda. Next to erasing poverty and hunger, another very important issue, and particularly in these days, we realize how important the issue is health. When we take a look here on the graphs I put here, United Nations graphs, for example, we can see that some of the health measures are certainly already showing effect. We can see declining rates, for example, for the AIDS infection, HIV. We can see also declines in the tuberculosis incidence rate, with nevertheless a high number of people developing this illness. We can see the effect of vaccinations, and therefore the importance of vaccinations. At the same time, we can see that vaccinations are still not available everywhere, and so on. Also, the death of the people or children of under 5, we can see a drop in that rate between 2000 and 2017. Nevertheless, when we look to the other slide, we can see that quite proportion of that group may be alive, but in a very desperate condition when it comes to food security. So let's take a look a little bit deeper into the issue of health. Of course, ensuring healthy lives and promoting the well-being at all ages, from very little to the very old days in life, is essential to sustainable development. Significant strides have been made in increasing life expectancy and also in reducing some of the common killers associated with child and maternal mortality, but working towards achieving the target of less than 7 maternal deaths per 100,000 live births by 2030 would still require significant improvements in skilled delivery care. Achieving the target of reducing premature death due to incommunicable diseases by a third by the year 2030 would also require more efficient technologies for clean fuel use during cooking and education on the risks of tobacco and so on. Many more efforts are needed to fully eradicate a wide range of diseases and address many different persistent and emerging health issues by focusing on providing more efficient funding of health systems, improved sanitation and hygiene. So again, we see another SDG affected here, increased access to physicians and more tips on ways to reduce ambient pollution. Significant progress can be made in helping to save the lives of millions. So again, the pollution issue, the output of industrial of gases, of pollutants from corporations, from factories, from cars, etc. That lets us think about another development goal with respect to cleaner industries, clean cities, sustainable cities, alternative energy. So a topic which we will also be addressing later on. So what is the current situation? We can look at child health, for example. 17,000 fewer children die each year than in 1919, but still more than 5 million children die before their 5th birthday each year. So we see improvement, but we still see dramatic numbers. We see, as I also said, when we're looking on the graphs on the slide here, that measles vaccines have averted nearly 15.6 million deaths since the year 2000. Despite determined global progress, an increasing proportion of child deaths are in sub-Saharan Africa and Southern Asia. 4 out of every 5 deaths of children under age 5 occurs in this region. So that is why sometimes particular regional approaches are necessary. Children born into poverty are almost twice as likely to die before the age of 5 as those from wealthier families. So that is again touching upon the very first SDG. Children of educated mothers, even mothers with only primary schooling, you can see how what difference at least a little bit of education makes, and we will come to that point when we talk about education and lifelong learning as another sustainable development goal, are more likely to survive than children of mothers with no education at all. When we look to the mothers directly, to maternal health, we can also see that maternal health has fallen . Sorry for the short interruption. So we stopped at the issue of maternal health, and as I started to say, maternal mortality has fallen by 37% since the year 2000. In Eastern Asia, Northern Africa, and Southern Asia, maternal mortality has declined by around 2/3 even. But maternal mortality ratio, so that is the proportion of mothers that do not survive childbirth compared to those who do, in developing regions is still 14 times higher than in the developed regions of this planet. More women are receiving antenatal care. In developing regions, antenatal care increased from 65% in 1990 to 83% in the year 2012. only half of women in developing regions receive the recommended amount of health care they need, however. Fewer teens are having children in the most developing regions, but progress has slowed on the other hand. So the large increase in contraceptive use in the 1990s was not matched, no more matched in the 2000 years. The need for family planning is slowly being met for more women, but demand is increasing at a rapid pace. So let's take a look at other at diseases like the human efficiency virus, HIV, also called the AIDS, malaria, other types of diseases. What do the numbers tell us? For example, with respect to HIV, in 2017 we had about 37 million people around the globe. Then 21.7 million people were accessing antiretroviral therapy, so therapy which is directed at fighting AIDS. 1.8 million people became newly affected with HIV in 2017, and nearly 1 million people, so it was 940,000 roundabout, died from AIDS-related illnesses in 2017. 77.3 million people have become infected with HIV since the start of the epidemic, so that's quite a big number. 35.4 million people have died from AIDS-related related illnesses since the start of the epidemic. So yeah, we see that type of virus is really a huge killer, and one has not found the perfect medication against it. So there is step-by-step improving of medication, and some positive news come through every now and then, but as the numbers tell, it is still a very, very big illness, a very great, very spread disease, and particularly also where the people do not have a lot of money, they can simply not afford the very expensive therapy which often comes along with it. Another illness, tuberculosis, we shall have a look on that. It remains the leading cause of death among people living with HIV, accounting for around 1 in 3 AIDS-related deaths. Globally, adolescent girls and young women face gender-based inequalities, exclusion, discrimination, and violence, which put them at increased risk of acquiring HIV. Also, HIV is the leading cause of death for women of reproductive age worldwide, and it's now the leading cause of death among adolescents, so that means people aged 10 to 19 in Africa, and the second most common cause of death among adolescents globally. Over 6.2 million malaria deaths have been averted between 2000 and 2015, primarily of children under 5 years of age in sub-Saharan Africa. The global malaria incidence rate has fallen by an estimated 37%, and the mortality rates by 58%. So that's a rough description of the global situation of these illnesses. We could also talk in length about other viral diseases, not only the current COVID-19 thing, but many other outbreaks of virus diseases, also like the MERS, Middle East Respiratory Syndrome some years ago, or any other forms. That would certainly go a little bit overboard here. So let us see what the Sustainable Development Goals include here, of number 3 includes here. By 2030, the aim is to reduce the global maternal mortality ratio to less than 70 per 100,000 live births, also to end preventable death of newborns and children under 5 years of age, with all countries aiming to reduce neonatal mortality to at least as low as 12 per 1,000 live births, and under 5 mortality to at least as low as 25 per 1,000 live births. Also, the epidemic of AIDS, tuberculosis, malaria, and other neglected tropical diseases should be ended. Also, hepatitis should be combated. Waterborne disease and other communicable diseases should be combated in a much more severe way. Another specific target is to reduce by 2030 by 1/3 premature mortality from non-communicable diseases through prevention and treatment and promotion of mental health and well-being, and also the strengthening of prevention and also the treatment of substance abuse, including narcotic drug abuse and the harmful use of alcohol. By 2020, the number of global death and injuries from road traffic accidents should be brought to half, so between 2015 and 2020. So we will see by the end of the year whether that aim has been reached successfully. And also by 2030, the aim is to ensure universal access to sexual and reproductive health care services, including for family planning, information on education, and the integration of reproductive health into national strategies and programs. There are more aims in the field of health, such as the achieving of universal health coverage, including financial risk protection, access to quality essential healthcare services, and access to safe, effective, quality, and affordable essential medicines and vaccines for everybody. Furthermore, the UN aims at substantially reducing the number of deaths and illnesses from hazardous chemicals and air, water, and soil pollution and contamination. So you see that is not directly an issue that can be treated by increasing the number of medication or making it accessible. But again, we see the interconnectedness with or with several other SDGs. Also, the strengthening of the implementation of the World Health Organization Framework Convention on Tobacco Control in all countries as appropriate is part of the plan. Also, the support of research and development of vaccines and medicines for the communicable and non-communicable diseases that primarily affect developing countries. The provision of access to affordable essential medicines and vaccines in accordance with the Doha Declaration on the TRIPS Agreement and Public Health, which affirms the right of developing countries to use the provisions in the Agreement on trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights regarding flexibilities to protect public health and, in particular, provide access to medicines for all. The last 2 points now, on the one hand, the substantial increase of health financing and the recruitment, development, training, and retention of the health workforce in developing countries, especially in LLDCs and small island developing states. And finally, the strengthening of the capacity of all countries, in particular developing countries, for early warning, risk reduction, and management of national and global health risks. And that, again, would bring us, of course, to the current corona outbreak, for example. Already when talking about other SDGs, I came across the importance of education and learning, lifelong learning. And we can see by looking at those UN graphs that, for example, 670 million children and adolescents lack a minimum proficiency in reading and mathematics. And these, of course, are absolutely essential skills when you want to get a chance for a little bit at least decent life. 750 million adults still remain illiterate, and 2/3 of them are women. It's also an important figure, and that also makes clear why, for example, the SDG of gender equality is also an important SDG, and we will talk about that in a couple of minutes. In Central Asia, 27% more girls than boys of primary school age are not attending school, so another gender inequality issue. And when we look at the situation of schools themselves, for example, we see that more than half of schools in sub-Saharan Africa do not have access to basic drinking water, to hand washing facilities, to the internet, to computers. So that affects, of course, again, the ability to let's say, develop education, but also to fundamental health issues, hygiene issues. So many other aspects are covered there, or affected here. 1 out of 5 children between 6 and 70 years old are not attending school at all. So again, that is a highly problematic number. Obtaining a quality education, however, is known to be the central foundation, one of the central foundations to creating sustainable development. In addition to improving quality of life, access to inclusive education can help equip locals with the tools required to develop innovative solutions to the world's greatest problems. And that's not the world's greatest problems in the sense that it's only problems of world range, but the world's greatest problems start in the villages around the world, in each little village, and tens of thousands and millions of villages. Over 265 million children are currently out of school, and 22% of them are of primary school age. And we talked about the mothers who have no education, and the children of whom basically are in a much larger risk to die early. So we can see that lack of education not only deprives people of decent lives, but maybe of life at all. Additionally, even the children who are attending schools are lacking basic skills in reading and mathematics, as we saw when we were looking at the graphs on this slide. In the past decade, major progress has been made towards increasing access to education at all levels and increasing enrollment rates in schools, particularly also for women and girls. Basic literacy skills have fortunately improved tremendously, yet bolder effects certainly are needed to make even greater strides for achieving universal education goals, because the numbers, as you saw, are still frightening. For example, the world has achieved equality in primary education between girls and boys, but few countries have achieved that target at the other levels, or even at all levels of education. The reasons for lack of quality education are due to lack of adequately trained teachers, for example, poor conditions of schools. Think back to the graph I showed you on the right-hand side, school conditions in sub-Saharan Africa, and equity issues related to opportunities provided to rural children. For quality education to be provided to the children of impoverished families, investment is needed in educational scholarships, for example, very much in teacher training workshops, school building, and improvement of water and electricity access to schools. So let us look a little bit more to numbers. The enrollment in primary education in developing countries has reached 91%, but 57 million primary-age children remain out of school. So even if the percentage number is improving, which is okay, which is good, we can see in absolute numbers that there are still too many individuals affected. More than half of children that have not enrolled in school live in sub-Saharan Africa. That will be in the future still a hotspot of of necessary action, but if that action is not there, also a hotspot of major problems. And these problems can be seen already there, that an estimated 50% of out-of-school children of primary school age live in conflict-affected areas, and here again we have the negative impact of the security development nexus. So what then are the specific targets in that field of education? So by 2030, UN wants to ensure that all girls and boys complete free, equitable, and quality primary and secondary education, leading to relevant and goal for effective learning outcomes. Also ensure that all girls and boys have access to quality early childhood development care and preliminary education, so that they are really ready for primary education, which is to follow then. Also to ensure equal access for all women and men to affordable and quality technical, vocational, and tertiary education, including university education. Also a substantial increase of the number of youth and adults who have relevant skills, including technical and vocational skills for employment, for decent jobs, for entrepreneurship, and so on, are on the agenda here. At the same time, the aim is to eliminate gender disparities in education and ensure equal access to all levels of education and vocational training for the vulnerable, including persons with disabilities, indigenous peoples, children in vulnerable situations, and so on. Also to ensure that all youth and substantial proportion of adults, and that means both men and women, achieve literacy and numeracy, so meaning that they can read and write and also count, deal with numbers, at least do the basic drills in mathematics and so on. Also by 2030 to ensure that all learners acquire the knowledge and skills needed to promote sustainable development, including through education for sustainable development and sustainable lifestyles, but also things like gender equality, human rights, promotion of a culture of peace and non-violence, how to deal with conflicts in a negotiation way rather than in a fighting way, the notion of global citizenship and appreciation of cultural diversity rather than racism, nationalism, and things like that. A culture, the culture's contribution to sustainable development shall be more cherished, and so on and so forth. So these elements are part of the package here. So concretely, the plan is to build and upgrade education facilities that are child, disability, and gender sensitive, and provide safe, non-violent, inclusive and effective learning environments for all. Also the substantial expansion around the globe of the number of scholarships available to developing countries, in particular least developed countries, small island developing states, and African countries for enrollment in higher education, including vocational training and information and communications technology, technical engineering, and scientific programs in developed countries, but also in developing countries. And finally, the aim is to substantially increase the supply of qualified teachers, including through international cooperation for teacher training in developing countries, especially least developed countries and small island developing countries shall be supported in that way. Now we come to the fifth development goal, and that is one goal we already touched upon a couple of times, namely gender equality and empowerment. Again, we start with a couple of data, of graphs, of information on the topic, again from the United Nations. And one, for example, says that 18% of ever partnered women and girls aged 15 to 49 have experienced physical and or sexual partner violence. It's a very sad number. At least 200 million girls and women have been subjected to female genital mutilation, half of them in West Africa, so that is also a very problematic number. Still, 30% of women aged 22 to 24 years were married before the age of 18. Also, this is sort of a problematic number, very much against the self-determination of individuals, of women. Despite all cultural particularities, it's something to think about. And in Southern Asia, for example, we can see kind of improvement. So the girl's risk of marrying in childhood has decreased by 40%. So that's just a number of figures to start with the topic. The goal in general, of course, is about the gender issue. So while the world has achieved progress towards gender equality and women's empowerment under the MDGs, so the Millennium Development Goals we were talking about in the beginning of the lecture, and those were including equal access to primary education between girls and boys, for example, women and girls continue to suffer discrimination and violence all around the world. Gender equality, and we have to really be aware of that, is not just a fundamental human right, but it is at the same time a crucial foundation for a peaceful, prosperous, and sustainable world, as the United Nations make clear. Unfortunately, at the current time, 1 in 5 women and girls between 15 and 49, as we have just seen on this graph, have reported experiencing physical or sexual violence by an intimate partner within a 12-month period, and 49 countries currently have no laws protecting women from domestic violence. And that is really a very problematic issue, a very problematic figure. Progress is occurring regarding harmful practices such as child marriage and female genital mutilation, often abbreviated as FGM, which has declined by 30% in the past decade, but there is still much work to be done to completely eliminate those practices. And with respect to the first one, the lack of laws against domestic violence, I mean, that is something where we really, over those countries affected, should think about working more in protecting the females, because females, even if they have particular roles maybe, or if there are particular role pictures, role models in society, they are definitely not property of man or of anybody. So they have rights, they have human rights, and they have to be respected as equal partners, as respectful partners. They carry a lot of responsibility for the family and everything, and that needs much more protection much more personal security. Another issue we talked about already is that issue of access to education, so providing women and girls with equal access to education, but not only to education, of course, also to health care, to decent work, to representation in politics, in processes of political decision making, also of economic decision making, for example. All that will fuel sustainable economies and benefit societies greatly, and also humanity at large. Implementing new legal frameworks regarding female equality in the workplace, for example, and also the eradication of harmful practices targeted at women is crucial to end the gender-based discrimination that is prevalent still in many countries all over the world. We can see that when we look at the numbers. So globally, 750 million women and girls were married before the age of 18, and at least 200 million women and girls in 30 countries have undergone the FGM practices, so the female genital mutilation practices. It's good to know that the rates here of girls between 15 and 19 who are subjected to FGM in the 30 countries where the practice is concentrated have dropped from 1 in 2 girls in 2000 to 1 in 3 girls in 2017. So we see an improvement there, but still a pretty high rate. In 18 countries, husbands can legally prevent their wives from working. In 39 countries, daughters and sons do not have equal inheritance rights, and 49 countries lack laws protecting women from domestic violence, as I said already. So we really can see there is a lot still to be done to reach an equal footing of women and men in a legal way, in an institutional way. We can see that 1 in 5 women and girls, including 19% of women and girls aged 15 to 49, have experienced physical violence. So I talked about that. And we have still enough countries, I mentioned the number 49 before, which do not have laws specifically to protect women from such violence. And just in case, also the other way around. So domestic violence is, as I have mentioned before, quite a big issue. While women have made important inroads to political office across the world, their representation in national parliaments, in politics in general, is still quite away from parity. So women are doing good at that. The ways have opened, even in very conservative countries. We can see that things are moving. But nevertheless, there is a lot to be done. At a good number, for example, in 46 countries, women now hold more than 30% of seats in national parliament in at least one chamber. So that's quite a good development. But when we take another number again, only 52% of women married or in a union freely make their own decisions about sexual relations, contraceptive use, and healthcare. So you see, there is also a big field where women can or are not entitled to their rights and to their will, to how they want to decide for themselves about their own body, for example. Women in Northern Africa hold less than 1 in 5 paid jobs in the non-agricultural sector. That's of course a regional number. When you look into particular states, you can see much better numbers there. Nevertheless, it's interesting to see how even if one country is riding the fast train, so to say, and being very good in that sector, in development of women's rights and of access for women to jobs, maybe of jobs in the public system, in the government system, etc. Also in private business. Other countries, for other reasons, are not as good, and that's also something you can think about. And maybe particularly since we are in Egypt, in Northern Africa, it might be interesting to look to the neighboring countries, why things are maybe not as good as they are working here in Egypt. More than 100 countries have taken action to track budget allocations for gender equality. And in Southern Asia, a girl's risk of marrying in childhood has also dropped significantly there. Given these numbers and given that situation, just of course shedding light on some of the aspects, we could talk for hours and weeks about gender and development, and there is a particular master program also here at FEPS dealing with gender and development, professional master program. You see how important that topic is. We see own gender-related theories in international relations, in other fields of political science, in social sciences in general. So it's a big topic, and everybody is invited to write about it, to think about it, particularly since in our class we have really a large proportion of female students, and I'm very proud and very happy to have that, to say that our program director with Dr. Riham is a woman. So we see that here obviously we don't have that issue too strong, but in many places of the world, in other contexts, we see it, and that is something, if you feel interested in it, you're most welcome to think about issues, talk about issues, write about issues here. So taken this context, what are the specific targets connected to the fifth Sustainable Development Goal? Very, very wide one, of course, is the wish to end all forms of discrimination against all women and girls everywhere until 2030. So as with other goals, the question is how realistic is that, particularly when you look into very minor forms of discrimination within families, within partnerships. That is something maybe even the governments are hard to work on that, even if they are willing to do so. Then another goal here is the elimination of all forms of violence against all women and girls in the public and private spheres, including trafficking and sexual and other types of exploitation. Again, that is a very important issue, and particularly the trafficking, etc., is something where governments already working on, have been working on for a while, and still we see how difficult it is, despite it's a very disgusting thing, the whole thing of sexual exploitation, sexual trafficking, how hard it is to bring those criminals who do that to women to justice. Nevertheless, the goal is there, and it should inspire governments and institutions to work even harder against that type of practice. And other aims include the elimination of all harmful practices such as child, early and forced marriage, also female genital mutilation, which is a very dangerous, very painful thing to do to females, and many of them get infections, they die while that procedure is being done, and those who don't, for the rest of their life, they might have severe problems in that area. And of course, child marriage, early marriage, forced marriage are things which are very much against the human dignity, against the right of determining yourself, etc. So again, that is something some cultures have to or should work on in an enforced way, just to show respect to the female members of their cultures. So, another big aim is to recognize and value unpaid care and domestic work through the provision of public services, infrastructure, and social protection policies, and the promotion of shared responsibility within the household and the family as nationally appropriate. So again, we have different cultures which bring different roles, gender roles, etc. And that all, of course, has to be respected as long as it is good for everybody involved. But when you see there is a sort of structural discrimination, for example, against women, but also against men, against boys, against girls, it is something we should be open to think about, to put it on the agenda, to put it into a discourse, to talk about it, and also to show alternatives. And that is definitely where also you are asked, so to say, as the more elite part of the Egyptian society, with access to resources, with access to public discourses, etc. Just to think critically about that. And also when we think about, maybe you're involved in South-South communications, Egypt being a key country between Europe, between Asia, the Middle East, and Africa, and from there also rises a sort of responsibility, of course, for developing the Sustainable Development Goals and helping maybe other countries in doing that. Just as the European Union, with its ideas of soft power, the idea of a normative power, of going and presenting itself as a model, of course, they are also asked to start with these ideas and help promote these ideas, assist people and countries to do that in a non-imperialist, non-neo-imperialist way, of course, but in a way that helps support particular developments. So it's a team project, a global project, where every country, every region should try to come up with the best solutions for the populations living there. And of course, that has to be done in realist ways, in sensitive ways, because we still have to respect the sovereignty of nations, the sovereignty of countries. But at the same time, these sovereign countries bear a great responsibility for their citizens and all citizens which are in the country, men and women, for example. Okay, that of course has also to do with the attempt to ensure women's full and effective participation and equal opportunities for leadership at all levels of decision-making in political, economic, and public life. And we can see how much we can profit, of course, from having able and determined women in politics, in economics, in corporations, in science, in research, etc. And many of our best researchers are also women, and why shouldn't they? So working together, men and women side by side, because they are good, they are brilliant, they are talented, they are eager to do something for their country, for science, for the people in whichever field. That's a very good thing to do. So this Sustainable Development Goals certainly also contributes to a more stable society and a more stable planet Earth. Furthermore, we can see the attempt to ensure universal access to sexual and reproductive health and reproductive rights as agreed in accordance with the Program of Action in the International Conference on Population and Development and the Beijing Platform for Action and the outcome documents of their review conferences. Planned is to undertake reforms to give women equal rights to economic resources, as well as access to ownership and control over land and other forms of property, financial services, inheritance, and natural resources, in accordance, of course, with the respective national laws, and hence the use of enabling technology, in particular information and communications technology, to promote the empowerment of women, and finally adopt and strengthen sound policies and enforceable legislation for the promotion of gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls on all levels. So let's move on from gender equality to our next topic, the next sustainable development goal, and that is dealing with drinking water and sanitation. So we already came about that, for example, when we were talking about poverty, the first development goal. So let's have again a look on the numbers here. On the very left, you can see 785 million people remain without even basic drinking water services. So that is really, really a huge number. And when you think basic drinking water services, that is something very, very basic. 2 out of 5 people worldwide do not have a basic hand washing facility with soap and water at home. And today, when you think about the corona crisis situation, and as I said, corona is not the only threat, even if it is very big at the moment. We have a lot of other critical health issues which can only be tackled on the basic level by basic hygiene, by washing hands with soap and running water. And when you see there are nearly 800 million without drinking water, 2 out of 5 people worldwide with no access to washing your hands properly. So that is a big, big issue for hygiene, for basic health. And again, we see how sustainable development goals just stick together, just belong together. Okay, let's move on a little bit deeper into the whole measure. Clean, accessible water for all, therefore, is an essential part of the world we want to live in. And there is sufficient fresh water on the planet to achieve it. However, due to bad economics or poor infrastructure, millions of people, including children, die every year from diseases associated with inadequate water supply, sanitation, and hygiene. Water scarcity, poor water quality, and inadequate sanitation negatively impact food security, livelihood choices, and educational opportunities, particularly for poor families across the world. And again, you can see we talk about food security, livelihood, educational opportunities. So 3 other issues, 3 other sustainable development goals are also directly linked to this sustainable development goal number 6, water and sanitation. At the current time, more than 2 billion people are living with the risk of reduced access to freshwater resources. And when we look a little bit into the future, the prognosis for 2050 shows us that then at least 1 in 4 people is likely to live in a country affected by chronic or recurring shortages of fresh water. Drought in specific afflicts some of the world's poorest countries, worsening hunger and malnutrition. So again here, the food security issue, sustainable development goal number 1 being affected here directly. Fortunately, there has been great progress made in the past decade regarding drinking sources and sanitation, whereby over 90% of the world's population now has at least access to improved sources of drinking water. But don't forget the figures I mentioned in the beginning. To improve sanitation and access to drinking water, there needs to be an increased investment in the management of freshwater ecosystems, also of sanitation facilities, particularly, of course, on the local levels in the developing countries. Particularly, we can see that in sub-Saharan Africa, in Central Asia, in Southern Asia, in Eastern and Southeastern Asia. So that brings us to the specific targets here. And by 2030, the United Nations attempts to achieve universal and equitable access to safe and affordable drinking water for all. And given the great numbers, we can see that there is still a lot to be done. Also by 2030, they want to achieve access to adequate and equitable sanitation and hygiene for all and end open defecation, paying special attention to the needs of women and girls and those in vulnerable situations. The water quality shall be improved significantly by reducing pollution, by eliminating dumping, and by minimizing the release of hazardous chemicals and materials, halving the proportion of untreated wastewater, and substantially increasing recycling and safe reuse globally. Another concrete aim is the increase of water use efficiency across all sectors and the attempt to ensure sustainable withdrawals and supply of fresh water to address water scarcity and substantially reduce the number of people suffering from water scarcity. Also, the implementation of integrated water resources management at all levels, including through transboundary cooperation, if possible, is something the United Nations try to achieve in cooperation with the various states of the world, with the various UN member states. And already this year, 2020, by 2020, they want to protect and restore water-related ecosystems, including mountains, forests, wetlands, rivers, aquifers, and lakes. So we might see some progress there, but certainly there is still a lot to be done, not only this year, but for the years to come. Very important there is the aim to expand international cooperation and capacity building support to developing countries in water and sanitation related activities and programs, and that includes water harvesting, desalination, water efficiency, wastewater treatment, and of course recycling and reuse technologies. Altogether, it's about supporting and strengthening the participation of local communities in improving water and sanitation management. So that is where, let's say, the global level, the international level, on the one hand, with technology transfers, etc., meet with the action which is definitely required on the local level. Another sustainable development goal, the 7th one here, is affordable, sustainable energy for all. I'll start with a good message. 9 out of 10 people worldwide have access to electricity, but that again is very differently distributed. So we see, for example, that 87% of the 840 million people are without electricity in the rural areas. And we can also see something with respect to energy efficiency. On average, 2.3% less energy was needed to create $1 of economic output each year between 2010 and 2016. So you can see that by improving technology, by being more energy sensitive, we can see that energy efficiency is something possible, but we are still not at the end of the tunnel there. And particularly when we take a closer look and look for clean cooking fuels, for example, we can see that 3 billion people lack clean cooking fuels and respective technology. At the moment, 17.5% of total final energy consumption comes from renewable energies compared to some years before, of course. That is a quite good number, but when we see how pressing and imminent the climate threat is at the moment, and we come to that a little bit closer when we look into the respective special Sustainable Development Goal there, we will see that 70.5% is still a much too little number to deal with. Energy, of course, is central to nearly every major challenge and opportunity the world faces today, be it for jobs, be it for security, be it for climate change, as mentioned, food security, food production, the increase of incomes, access to energy for all is really essential. Working towards this goal is especially important as it interlinks with other sustainable development goals. We saw that issue before already, that interlink, but when it comes to energy, that interlink becomes extremely salient. Focusing on universal access to energy, increased energy efficiency, and the increased use of renewable energy through new economic and job opportunities is crucial to creating more sustainable and inclusive communities and resilience to environmental issues like climate change. At the current time, when we look, we will see that there are approximately 3 billion people who lack access to clean cooking solutions and are exposed to dangerous levels of air pollution. So we just have to look to cities like Mumbai or Delhi, or cities in China also, but sometimes also cities in the Balkans when we look to the European continent. Additionally, slightly less than 1 billion people are functioning without electricity, and 50% of them are found in sub-Saharan Africa alone. Fortunately, progress has been made in the past decade regarding the use of renewable electricity from water, from solar, and from wind power, and the ratio of energy use per unit of GDP is also declining. We will be talking about renewable energies, the sustainability and energy in the next lecture. Originally, I wanted to talk about that already today, but I realized that talking about the Sustainable Development Goals takes much more time and effort if you want to do it in a way not just to mention, to name them, but to think a little bit about them. And it is really worth, and I think you share that idea with me now after going through a couple of them, that it needs to be done thoroughly just to understand how they are interconnected. And a class that is dealing with energy, environment, and sustainability cannot neglect them, cannot ignore them, or can just pass roughly over them. So that is why I decided rather spontaneously to look much deeper into them. So we talked in the last sessions when we were still meeting in the classroom about how to measure sustainability. Last week I talked about what sustainability is, how we conceptualize it, etc., what ways are there to define it, etc. Now we look into the goals, and from there we go even deeper into the issues in the weeks to follow, starting with that topic we are just talking about, namely energy and also water. Okay, so continue here means that the challenge is far from being solved, and we will see that when we even look closer in the next weeks. And there needs to be more access to clean fuel, more access to technology, more progress needs to be made regarding integrating renewable energy into end-use applications, for example, in buildings, in the whole transport industry, in industry in general. Public and private investments in energy also need to be increased, and there needs to be more focus on regulatory frameworks and innovative business models to transform the world's energy systems to become more sustainable and less resource consuming, less climate problematic, and so on. So and that is really important because 13% of the global population still lacks access to modern electricity. 3 billion people, imagine 3 billion people rely on wood, coal, charcoal or animal waste for cooking and heating. And that is really something problematic. Energy is the dominant contributor to climate change, accounting for about 60% of total greenhouse gas emissions, and that is therefore one of the key factors to be addressed. And that is also one of the reasons why I said we cannot just add it a little bit to that lecture talking about energy. And you saw in your videos which I asked you to watch for today how let's say complex the issue is, and we will go into that even more detailed next week. Indoor air pollution from using combustible fuels for household energy caused 4.3 million deaths in 2012, with women and girls accounting for 6 out of every 10 of these. The share of renewable energy, as I said, has reached 17.5% in 2015, which is good, but still far from perfect. So what are the specific targets of this Sustainable Development Goal? The United Nations by 2030 wants to ensure universal access to affordable, reliable and modern energy services. So that really requires a big effort also on the side of the industry. Also, the UN wants a substantial increase of the share of renewable energy in the global energy mix. And we can see, particularly after the pro-climate movement we saw this summer, so in the summer of 2019 to be precise, that states, particularly in Europe, were very much put under pressure by the public opinion, by particular people who closed schools, who said we don't go to school anymore on Fridays, even if it was against the law, and you can see that pretty critically. But nevertheless, they went on the streets. They said, okay, Fridays for future, which became a big movement. And that made governments act, that made the European Commission act, the European Union act, the new Commission, the new president of the Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, came up with the Green Deal. And of course, that Green Deal is again something maybe to be disputed, and the climate activists were not very happy with what they saw, and also the measures of the federal government in Germany, which are quite a big step forward for a industrial country, are disputed by climate activists. But we can see, for example, that there is a big economic stake included in that, and the traditional forms of engines, of combustion engines, which were used and developed by car providers such as BMW and Mercedes, etc., all the great names. You don't know, maybe they miss the train or they miss the autobus, and then they fall behind when it comes to modern forms of engines. So maybe the pressure coming from the street is also quite helpful for an industry to develop and keep on the line. And at the moment, what we see with the coronavirus, the shutdown of societies, etc., which will bring about many economic problems, of course, but maybe we can see at the moment that the environment indeed gets protection from that type of shutdown. And of course we cannot keep our economies shut down, not at all, but maybe that can be an inspiration for the engineers, for the governments, for the scientists, etc., to develop new forms, faster new forms, better forms, more efficient forms of energy, of climate saving energy forms, forms of transportation, forms of engines, and so on. And that is all also part of the idea of the United Nations and the Sustainable Development Goal number 7 here. That also translates into the aimed for expansion of infrastructure and the upgrade of technology for supplying modern and sustainable energy services for all in developing countries, in particular least developed countries, small island developing states, and so on. Also landlocked developing countries, in accordance, of course, with their respective programs of support. And of course, closely related is the idea of economic growth, of decent work for everybody. So protection, sustainable development, and all that not necessarily need a decrease in wealth, a decrease in economy, but it means a restructuring of economy in an intelligent, in a clever way, so that the general growth, economic growth, in the world can increase, but not at the cost of resource damaging, of damaging of the environment, of damaging the human people, the human individuals being involved in those processes. So that's also the idea of a decent living. So 1/5 of young people are not in education, employment, or training. So that means 20%, and that's a number which should be improved. We can see the issue of gender again. The median hourly pay of men is 12% higher than that of women. I mean, of course, again, we have to look detailed into statistics there and see why that is the case, and can we compare the jobs, why maybe do women make different jobs than men do, etc. So it's a complex topic, but still it's something to think about critically when we talk about sustainable economic growth. So we talked about that already when we were thinking about the issue of poverty, the first SDG. So we saw that roughly half of the world's population still lives on the equivalent of about $2 a day, with global unemployment rates of 5.5%, 5.7%, something around that, and having a job that doesn't guarantee the ability to escape from poverty in many places. This slow and uneven progress, and that is the real problem. It's slow progress, but it's also, and in particular, an uneven progress, and that fact requires us to think and retool our economic and social policies aimed at eradicating poverty, as also indicated in SDG 1. A continued lack of decent work opportunities, of insufficient investments and underconsumption led to an erosion of the basic social contract underlying democratic societies. That all must share in progress. That's the idea. So there is, of course, one thing if you increase the wealth in absolute numbers, but when you at the same time increase the inequality within a society, and you have those rich ones getting richer and richer, and the not so rich ones, the poor ones, the underprivileged ones, even getting in a worse situation, in a more precarious situation, then the legitimacy of societies, of political systems is also questioned increasingly. And the question then is how do the people react, how do the governments react? And we can see basically increasing forms of destabilizing societies and states. Even though the average annual growth rate of real GDP per capita worldwide is increasing year on year, there are still many countries in the developing world that are decelerating in their growth rates and moving farther from the 7% growth rate target set for 2030. So what I just said with respect to the development within societies, that the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, to put it in a nutshell, we can see those developments sometimes also with respect to the global situation when we compare states. As labor productivity decreases and unemployment rates rise, standards of living begin to decline due to lower wages. Sustainable economic growth as an aim will require societies to create conditions that allow people to have quality jobs, like decent jobs, that at the same time can stimulate the economy and at the same time do not harm the environment. Job opportunities and decent working conditions are also required for the whole working age population. There needs to be increased access to financial services to manage incomes, accumulate assets, and make productive investments. Increased commitments to trade, banking, and agricultural infrastructure will also help increase productivity. That's at least the expectation of the United Nations, and with that, in the end, also reduce unemployment levels in the world's most impoverished region. So what does that look like in particular? What are the specific targets here? Sustained per capita economic growth in accordance with national circumstances, and in particular at least 7% gross domestic product growth per annum in the least developed countries. That is what the United Nations would like to achieve. They also would like to achieve higher levels of economic productivity through diversification, technological upgrading, and innovation, including through a focus on high value added and labor intensive sectors, promotion of development-oriented policies that support productive activities, decent job creation, entrepreneurship, creativity and innovation, and also the encouragement of the formalization and growth of micro enterprises, also small enterprises, also medium-sized enterprises including through access to financial services. It is also intended to improve progressively through 2030 global resource efficiency in consumption and production, and endeavor to decouple economic growth from environmental degradation in accordance with the 10-year framework of programs on sustainable consumption and production, with developed countries taking the lead. Finally, the United Nations wants to achieve full and productive employment and decent work for all women and men, including also young people and persons with disabilities, and equal pay for work of equal value. So in that context, also the substantial reduction of the proportion of youth not in employment, education or training shall be reached. And that means that immediate and effective measures to eradicate forced labor shall be taken. That also is aimed at ending modern forms of slavery, of course, human trafficking, and also to secure the prohibition and elimination of the worst forms of child labor, including recruitment, the use of child soldiers where we can find it, and already by 2025 end child labor in all its forms. On a different level, also the protection of labor rights and the promotion of safe and secure working environments for all workers, including migrant workers, including, for example, also women migrants and those in precarious employment, are another very important, very crucial aim, because we also in industrial countries, by the way, we can see the increase of precarious employment, and even in industrial countries we can see basically first class and second class and third class employees, if you want to put it that way, with very different rights, very different entitlements, etc., very different types of protection, of social protection, and that is, well, something affecting industrial countries and in different forms, and certainly in even harder forms, of course, the developing countries. Further, by 2030, it is aimed to devise and implement policies to promote sustainable tourism that creates jobs and promotes local culture and products. So that is a trend against a uniform type of globalization that shows respect for local cultures, for local products. It shall enable the production there, the marketing, within structures which really help the local population, and also tourism, of course, and we know that from Egypt how important tourism is, and we can see how also the protection of the reefs in the Red Sea, for example, or the protection of cultural heritage has helped the Egyptian tourism industry to become more sustainable, and also therefore more lasting, or providing more lasting opportunities for the people who live there in the ways they want to live here. Then the strengthening of the capacity of domestic financial institutions is aimed for. That is important to encourage and expand access to banking, insurance and financial services for all. So when we have stable financial services there within the countries, within African, within Asian countries, which are self-dependent, so to say, then they can also provide for services tailored to the local needs. An increase of aid for trade support for developing countries, in particular the LLDCs, including through the enhanced integrated framework for trade-related technical assistance to LLDCs, is something. And last but not least, already by 2020 to develop and operationalize a global strategy for youth employment and implement the implementation of the Global Jobs Pact of the ILO, the International Labour Organization. Very closely linked to the sustainable goal number 9, 8 is the sustainable development goal number 9, industrialization, innovation, infrastructure. And what we can see already here in the numbers, industrialization in the less developed countries is too slow at the moment to meet the 2030 agenda target. We can see, for example, on the other hand, that we see an increased global investment in research and development, currently being $2 trillion, up from 739 billion. So that's quite an increase within these 16 years. And we can see the medium, high, and high-tech sectors that currently account for 45% of the global manufacturing value added. But at the same time, we can see the unequal distribution of that income sector over the world. So let's take a closer look into this field, into the field having to do with the social development goal number 9. Yeah, so investments in infrastructure. What is infrastructure? Sure, it's transport, it's irrigation, it's energy, it's information communication technology. These investments are crucial to achieving sustainable development and empowering communities in many countries. It has really long time been recognized that growth in productivity and incomes and improvements in health and education outcomes require investment in infrastructure. So again, we see how development goals stick together and how improving one can have a positive effect also on others, or a needed effect also, not only positive but also needed with respect to others. Manufacturing is an important driver of economic development and deployment. At the current time, however, manufacturing value added per capita is only $100 in the least developed countries compared to over 4,500 in Europe and Northern America. Another important factor to consider is the emission of carbon dioxide during manufacturing processes. Emissions have decreased over the past decade in many countries, but the pace of decline has not been even around the world. Technological process and technological progress is the foundation of efforts to achieve environmental objectives such as increased resource and energy efficiency. Without technology and innovation, we will see that there won't be any industrialization. And what would that mean? Without industrialization, also development will not happen. There needs to be more investments, therefore, in high-tech products that dominate, as we have just seen in the numbers on the slide, the manufacturing productions to increase efficiency and a focus on, for example, mobile cellular services that increases connections between people. So what are the specific targets of that goal? UN wants to develop quality, reliable, sustainable and resilient infrastructure, including regional and transborder infrastructure, to support economic development and human well-being with a focus on affordable and equitable access for all. It is also important for them to promote inclusive and sustainable industrialization by 2030, significantly raising industry's share of employment and gross domestic product in line with national circumstances, of course, and double its share in least developed countries. particularly the access of small-scale industrial and other enterprises, in particular, of course, in developing countries to financial services, meaning, for example, affordable credit, and then their integration into the value chains, into the markets on the national, on the regional, and the global levels are also part of the agenda. That also applies to the upgrade of infrastructure and the retrofitting of industries to make them sustainable with increased resource use efficiency and greater adoption of clean and environmentally sound technologies and industrial processes, with all countries taking action in accordance with their respective capabilities. Another issue in that context is an enhanced scientific research, an upgrade of technological capabilities of industrial sectors in the countries, in all countries of course, but particularly again in the developing world, including by 2030 the encouragement of innovation and the substantial increase of the number of research and development facilities, of research and development workers per 1 million people in public and private research and development spending. So that's quite a big number, which is aimed there for also the facilitation of sustainable and resilient infrastructure development in developing countries through enhanced financial, technological, and technical support to these countries. And there the focus is very much on Africa, but also on small islands, for example, are part of that package. Furthermore, there is the wish to support domestic technology development, research and innovation in developing countries, including by ensuring a conducive policy environment for example, industrial diversification and value addition to commodities. And finally, the aim is to significantly increase access to information and communications technology and the strive to provide universal and affordable access to the internet in the least developed countries as soon as possible. I already mentioned the problem of inequality within countries, inequality between the countries, and not only in the context of other SDGs we can find that issue, but there is goal number 10 specifically directed at this problem. For example, we can see in more than half of the 92 countries with available data, income of the bottom 40% of the population grew faster than the national average, which is a very nice thing. In many countries, an increasing share of income goes to the top 1%, however, while the bottom 30% receive less than 25% of the overall income. So we can see quite significant differences here, and of course we have to think about why that is caused, what implications that has, etc. And that is why United Nations took up that highly important issue there into the goals. So let's take a closer look on the issue and also on United Nations action there. We can see, when we take a general look, that the international community has made strides towards lifting people out of poverty. We also have seen, particularly when we talked about it, the first and second issue, that there is still a lot to be done. The most vulnerable nations in that context, that is the LLDCs, the least developed countries, also the landlocked developing countries and the small island developing states, continue to make inroads into poverty reduction. We can see that all, but inequality does persist and large disparities remain regarding access to health and education services and other assets. So we already talked about these development goals and the problems which are there. The growing consensus which we can see at the moment is that economic growth is not sufficient to reduce poverty if it is not inclusive and if it does not involve the 3 dimensions of sustainable development. Maybe you can remember them. We talked about them last week when we were discussing the concept of sustainability, namely the economic dimension, the social dimension, and the environmental dimension. Fortunately, we can say that income inequality has been reduced both between and within the countries. At the current time, the per capita income of 60 out of 94 countries with data has risen more rapidly than the national average. There has been some progress regarding creating favorable access conditions for exports from these developing countries as well. But to reduce inequality further, policies should be universal in principle, paying attention to the needs of disadvantaged and marginalized populations. There needs to be an increase in, for example, duty-free treatment and continuation of favoring exports from developing countries. That is something we, as a matter of fact, don't see as much as we might need it. Also, we might have to think about increasing the share of developing countries' vote within institutions such as the IMF. And finally, innovations in technology can help reduce the cost, for example, of transferring money for migrant workers. So on many levels, there is something which might contribute to reach this particular development goal. When we look at the numbers, we can see that in 2016, about 65% of products exported by the least developed countries to world markets faced 0 tariffs. That is an increase of 20% since 2010. Evidence from developing countries shows that children in the poorest 20% of the populations are still up to 3 times more likely to die before their 5th birthday than children in the richest quintiles. Social protection has been significantly expanded and extended globally, yet persons, for example, with disabilities are up to 5 times more likely than average to incur catastrophic health expenditures. Despite overall declines in maternal mortality, we also talked about that in another context before, in most developing countries, women in rural areas are still up to 3 times more likely to die while giving birth than women living in urban centers. And up to 30% of income inequality is due to inequality within households, including between women and men. Women are also more likely than men to live below 50% of the median income. Again, we see cross connections with quite a number of other SDGs, and we can now take a look on how the specific targets for this SDG 9 might contribute to an overall improvement of sustainability in the world by 2030. From this perspective, UN wants progressively achieve and sustain income growth of the bottom 40% of the population at a rate higher than the national average. Also empower and promote the social, economic, and political inclusion of all, irrespective of age, sex, disability, race, ethnicity, origin, religion, or economic or any other status. Ensure equal opportunity and reduce inequalities of outcome, including by eliminating discriminatory laws, policies and practices, and promoting appropriate legislation, policies, and action in this regard. Another approach is, or an additional approach is to adopt policies, especially fiscal, wage, and social protection policies, in order to progressively achieve greater equality, and then to improve also the regulation and monitoring of global financial markets and institutions, and strengthen the implementation of respective regulations. In addition, the goal is to ensure enhanced representation and voice for developing countries in decision-making in global international economic and financial institutions. I mentioned the IMF as an example before, in order to deliver more effective, credible, accountable, and legitimate institutions. Furthermore, the UN wants to facilitate orderly, safe, regular, and responsible migration and mobility of people, including through the implementation of planned and well-managed migration policies. We can see this topic currently, particularly in the Euro-Mediterranean relations, very important one, and particularly also the role the European Union plays there, Turkey plays there, Morocco, for example, plays there, is also very interesting. And I know that for some of you, particularly the migration topic is a topic also in which you're interested for a little paper. So you can see that is a really crucial issue from many perspectives, and very worth looking deeper into. Further, the United Nations are interested in implementing the principle of special and differential treatment for developing countries, and in particular, of course, the LLDCs, in accordance with the WTO agreements, encourage official development official development assistance and financial flows, including foreign direct investment to states where the need is greatest. That, of course, is again the LLDCs, sub-Saharan countries in Africa, and so on and so forth. And in general, by 2030, it is aimed to reduce the loss to less than 3% the transaction costs of migrant remittances, and the elimination of remittance corridors with costs higher than 5%. That all is aimed at reducing the inequality, and we will see how that works. We already talked about on several occasions on the difference between the rural areas and the urban areas, and sustainability is an important issue in both. This sustainable development goal particularly is looking at the urban areas, at the cities, and the notion, the concept of sustainable city is something which is central here. We can see that, for example, 2 billion people do not have access to waste collection services. Again, that might have terrible implications for the health situation. We can see that in 2018, 1 out of 4 urban residents was living in slum-like conditions, so very, very bad housing, rundown housing, no access to water, no access to electricity, not a big deal of security in there, so very dangerous, lack of education, of access to education, and so on and so forth. So many of the things we were talking about when we were looking into the details and the backgrounds of the other SDGs, which are basically problematic and have to be overcome. Other issues here: 9 out of 10 urban residents breathe polluted air, so also causing severe health effects, for example, or the access or lack of access to public transport is also quite a bit of a problem. So let's look a little bit into the city issue. Why are cities per se important? Cities can be regarded as hubs for ideas, for commerce, for culture, for science, for productivity, for social development, and so on and so forth. When we look from a positive side here at their best, cities have enabled people to advance socially and economically. With the number of people living within cities, which is at the moment projected to rise to 5 billion people by 2030, of course it is very important, it is crucial that efficient urban planning and urban management practices are in place to deal with the challenges that come along with that dramatically increasing urbanization. Many challenges exist to maintain cities in a way that continues to create jobs and prosperity on the one hand without straining land and resources on the other. So we always see that type of tension here, increasing prosperity, but at the same time trying to save resources. That is basically what we also had in the definition and the concepts of sustainability and the Brundtland report and so on. Common urban challenges include congestion. So that is something we here in Cairo see basically every day when we try to go to work, when we try to go to the university, when we try to go back home. So that is a big thing, not only Cairo, but also we can see that in Berlin or Mexico City or New York or Chicago or Shanghai or wherever. But also a lack of funds to provide basic services in many cities, a shortage of adequate housing, declining infrastructure, rising air pollution within cities, etc. Rapid urbanization challenges, such as safe removal and management of solid waste within cities, can be overcome in ways that allow them to continue to thrive and grow while improving resource use and reducing pollution and poverty. One such example is an increase in municipal waste collection. There needs to be a future in which cities provide opportunities for all with access to basic services, energy, housing, transportation, and more. Rapid urbanization is exerting pressure also on freshwater supplies, on sewage, the living environment, and public health. And there is a lot of things we have to address. So when we talk about these issues like freshwater supply, sewage, sanitation, so we already had the specific development goal dealing with this. And also next week we will not only talk about energy, but also about water, about sanitation, etc. And both with respect to water and to energy, we will also take up the issue, already prepared that, of a sustainable city. And we take the example of one city in the Emirates. But let us talk first of all about the SDG here. By 2030, the UN wants to ensure access for all to adequate, safe and affordable housing and basic services, and also to upgrade slums, upgrade substandard living zones to decent living zones, also provide access to safe, affordable, accessible and sustainable transport systems for all, improving road safety, notably by expanding public transportation with special attention to the needs of those also in vulnerable situations, for women, for children, for persons with disabilities, for elder persons, but of course for everyone going to school, to university, to work, commuting back and forth without having to sit in traffic jams for 2-3 hours every day, cars in their traffic jams polluting the air with harmful effects on public health. In general, we can say that by 2030, inclusive and sustainable urbanization and capacity for participatory, integrated and sustainable human settlement, planning and management shall be attained in all countries around the world. The idea is to strengthen efforts to protect and safeguard also the world's cultural and natural heritage with these measures. And also, of course, the wish is to significantly reduce the number of deaths and number of people affected and substantially decrease the direct economic losses relative to global gross domestic product caused by disaster, including water-related disasters, with a focus on protecting particularly those people who are in vulnerable situations, who are poor, etc. Also, the adverse per capita environmental impact of cities shall be reduced, including, for example, by paying special attention to air quality and municipal and other waste management. Also, the provision of universal access to safe, inclusive and accessible green and public spaces, parks, etc. Shall be part of the program. And we can see also that the United Nations is interested in supporting positive economic, social and environmental links between urban, peri-urban and rural areas by strengthening national and regional development planning. What the UN also aims at is substantially increasing the number of cities and human settlements adopting and implementing integrated policies and plans towards inclusion, resource efficiency, mitigation and adaptation to climate change, resilience to disasters, and developing and implementing in line with the Sendai framework of disaster risk reduction 2015 to 2030, a holistic disaster risk management system at all levels. You can see the idea of redesigning cities, of making cities safe for the future, for sustainability, is also a big challenge, and maybe for people who live in a small town in Germany it may be not as clear to grasp, but for us who know Cairo, for example, as a mega city, a megalopolis, we can, I think, feel very well what challenge it is for everyone, for the government, for all stakeholders involved to develop the city further to meet those ideas and requirements of the United Nations and to make Cairo a very livable place for everyone, not only now but in the future. And yeah, that's a big challenge, but when the challenge is met and solved to a certain degree, it can be a model city, of course, in the world, and we can see that also there are quite intensive developments into this direction. Another goal here is the idea of responsible consumption and production. When we take a look here on the left graph, we can see that developed countries use 1/5 of natural resources to produce the same amount of economic output as developing countries. So there is a big gap in efficiency. At the same time, we can see here, when we look at the material footprint per capita in high income countries, and that is 60% higher than in upper middle income countries and more than 13 times the level of low income countries. So that has a lot to do with the ways of life and the possibilities to develop that particular way of life. And we can see the third column here that nearly 100 countries are actively adopting policies and measures to promote sustainable consumption and production. So let's take these three basic data, so to say, and move on. to the idea what is meant by that, and we can say that sustainable consumption and production has to do with promoting resource and energy efficiency, with sustainable infrastructure, and with providing access to basic services, green and decent jobs, and a better quality of life for everybody. Its implementation helps to achieve overall development plans, reduce future economic, environmental, and social costs, strengthen economic competitiveness, and finally reduce poverty. At the current time, material consumption of natural resources is increasing, particularly within Eastern Asia. Countries are also continuing to address challenges regarding air, water, and soil pollution. Since sustainable consumption and production aims at doing more and better with less, so as you could see, it's about efficiency, about the efficient use of resources to generate still better outcomes. We can see that net welfare gains from economic activities can increase by reducing resource use, by reducing degradation, and by reducing pollution along with the whole life circle, while increasing the quality of life. And that is something, of course, the industry should strive for, because technological solutions which can be marketed on the planet, which can improve the life situation, which can improve the environmental situation, are part of the industries of the future. And we will talk about that in more detail, for example, when we talk about the energy issue next week, because we can see that a lot of investment is done in green energy, for example, or in let's say, in solar energy. Of course, sometimes coming with high risk, but also with great opportunities. But there also needs to be a significant focus on operating on supply chain involving everyone from producer to final consumer. This includes educating consumers on sustainable consumption and lifestyle. So people have to become aware of that, have to learn that, have to change their way of lives, be willing to accept new forms of living, new forms of consumption. And that means providing them with adequate information through standards, maybe through labels, engaging in sustainable public procurement, and so on and so forth. So why is it important to address that? Should the global population really reach 9.6 billion by the year 2050, as the prognosis currently say? The equivalent of almost 3 planets could be required to provide the natural resources needed to sustain the current lifestyles. So that is something really we have to think about it. 3 planets Earth would be needed if things were left unchanged, if they were to continue as they are at the moment, with that form of consumption, the form of production, the form of lifestyle, etc. And we don't have 2 more planets available. That's the problem. So that is why we have to really address that issue. That is why the United Nations put it on the agenda. With rises in the use of non-metallic materials within infrastructure and construction, there has been significant improvement, for example, in the material standard of living. The per capita material footprint of developing countries increased from 5 metric tons in 2000 to 9 metric tons in 2017. 93% of the world's 250 largest companies are now reporting on sustainability. Less than 3% of the world's water is fresh drinkable, of which 2.5% is frozen in the Antarctica, the Arctic, and the glaciers. Humanity must therefore rely on 0.5% for all of man's ecosystems and freshwater needs. Humankind is polluting water, however, in rivers and lakes faster than nature can recycle and purify. more than 1 billion people still do not have access to fresh water, to drinkable water. And the excessive use of water in some places contributes to the global water stress. What about energy? If people worldwide switched to energy-efficient light bulbs, the world would save $120 billion annually. Despite technological advances that have promoted energy efficiency gains, energy use in OECD countries is to continue at the moment to grow another 35% by this year. So commercial and residential energy use in the second most rapidly growing area of global energy use after transport. In 2002, the motor vehicle stock in OECD countries was 550 million vehicles, and 3/4 of that, 75% of that, which were basically private cars, personal cars. 32% increase in vehicle ownership is taking place now. At the same time, motor vehicle kilometers are projected now to increase by 40%, and global air travel is projected to triple over the couple of years. So at the moment we see basically a sharp decrease in that due to Corona. So nearly all the fleets of the world are grounded at the moment. People are to stay at home. And as I said, we don't know what the impact is. Maybe this time next year we will see those numbers which I just mentioned continue. We will see all the planes in the air again. We will see people driving more, buying more cars. Or we see maybe a change in that type of lifestyle, and we might see more efficient ways to travel, at least the development of those. So sometimes we have those big events and they have lasting impacts. We don't know, but at the moment we still have to rely on, or at least work with, the prognosis we get from the data specialists and from the statistics which are available from UN and OECD and so on and so forth. And they say that households, for example, consume 29% of global energy and consequently contribute to similar numbers, a little bit less, but also in the 20% of resultant CO2 emissions. The share of renewable energy in final energy consumption has reached 17.5%, which is good. We talked about that number, we came across that number already, but still there is much more to be attained. While substantial environmental impacts from food, so it's also interesting to look at food, occur in the production phase, meaning agriculture, food processing. Households influence these impacts through their dietary choices and habits. This consequently affects the environment through food-related energy consumption and waste generation. Each year, when you take a closer look here, an estimated third of all food produced, and that is an equivalent to 1.3 billion tons, worth around $1 trillion, ends up rotting in the bins of consumers and retailers or spoiling due to poor transportation and harvesting practices. 2 billion people globally are overweight or even obese. So when we contrast these numbers to the goal where we said hunger has to be fought, we see a real terrible situation here, that half of the population is starving, or more or less, and the other half is simply too fat to be healthy. Another issue: land degradation, declining soil fertility, unstable water use, overfishing, marine environment degradation. All those are lessening the ability of the natural resource base to supply food. So basically we are sitting on a branch of a tree and we take the saw and we saw into that branch. The food sector accounts for around 30% of the world's total energy consumption and accounts for about 22% of total greenhouse gas emissions. In that context, the United Nations developed particular targets. For example, the implementation of a 10-year framework of programs on sustainable consumption and production, with all countries asked to take action, with developed countries which shall take the lead, and that framework is taking into account the development and capabilities of developing countries. By 2030, what shall be achieved? It shall be achieved the sustainable management and efficient use of natural resources. Another aim is to halve per capita global food waste at the retail and consumer levels and reduce food losses along the production and supply chains, including post-harvest losses. What also shall be attained is the environmentally sound management of chemicals and all waste throughout the life cycle in accordance with agreed international frameworks, and significantly reduce the release to air, water and soil in order to minimize adverse impacts on human health and also on the environment. Also, the waste generation shall be reduced significantly through prevention, reduction, recycling and reuse measures. Companies are being encouraged, and that particularly affects large and transnational, multinational corporations, to adapt sustainable practices and to integrate sustainability information into their reporting cycle. So that is something also interesting for the business administration people. Then the promotion of public procurement practices that are sustainable, of course in accordance with national policies and priorities. Then the assurance that people everywhere have the relevant information and awareness for sustainable development and lifestyles in harmony with nature. So again, that means to tell the people, to help the people understand, to become aware, to make them develop the conviction that lifestyles have to be changed in order to protect themselves on the long run, protect others on the long run, to enable a living for the next generations and so on. Also, the support of developing countries when it comes to strengthening their scientific and technological capacity to move towards more sustainable patterns of consumption and production, and so on. So that is basically what United Nations wants to attain there, and we will move to the next goal now. And this goal is the combat of climate change. We already came to this issue on several other occasions before. We can see at the moment that compared to pre-industrial levels, we currently see an atmospheric concentration of CO2 of 146%. To limit global warming to 1.5 centigrade, global carbon emissions needs to fall to 55% of 2010 levels by 2030 and continue a steep decline to zero net emissions latest by 2050. That topic here, climate change, would also be a topic basically for a whole seminar, and we would have to look into a lot of scientific data, reports, etc. Even by not just mentioning it and going a little bit deeper, we cannot cover the whole complex issue and the whole politically disputed issue, but still it's one of the most important issues probably we are dealing with, and that is why I really want to make you very much aware of the topic. Climate change, of course, now is affecting every country on every continent. It is disrupting national economies, and it is affecting lives. It is costing people, communities, and countries dearly today and even more tomorrow, I dare say. Weather patterns are changing. We can see that sea levels are rising, making a lot of trouble for countries with coastlines, or even more for little islands like the Maldives. Weather events are becoming more extreme. We can see that everywhere around the world. We can see that greenhouse gas emissions are now at their highest levels in history. And without action, that is what it means. The world's average surface temperature is likely to surpass 3 degrees centigrade this century. Everybody will be affected by that. And the poorest and most vulnerable people, of course, will be affected the most. Affordable, scalable solutions are now available to enable countries to leapfrog to cleaner, more resilient economies. The pace of change, we can see, is quickening now as more people are turning to renewable energy and a range of other measures that will reduce emissions and increase adoption efforts. Climate change, however, is a global challenge that does not respect national borders. It is an issue that requires solutions that need to be coordinated at the international level to help developing countries move toward a low-carbon economy, but also to enable and to bring industrial countries to deal with it. And we can see, for example, how problematic political leaders such as Donald Trump are, who basically claim that climate change is not a problem, maybe it is even not existent, and American interests and the interests of the American economy, the short-term interests, are much more important than the survival of the world or whatsoever. To strengthen, therefore, the global response to the threat of climate change, countries adopted the Paris Agreement at the COP21 in Paris, which went into force in November 2016. But we saw that some countries are not really very happy with it and already left it. So in the agreement, all countries agreed at that time to work to limit global temperature rise to well below 2 degrees centigrade. As of April 18th, 175 parties had ratified the Paris Agreement, and 10 developing countries had submitted their first iteration of their national adaptation plans for responding to climate change. But when there are important partners leaving, such an agreement might be dead pretty quickly, or at least weakened significantly, and the negative effects will grow also in a significant way. So what are the specific targets then of our 13th development goal here? Strengthen the resilience and adaptive capacity to climate-related hazards and natural disasters in all countries, and these disasters are increasing, as we saw. Integrate climate change measures into national policies, strategies, and planning. Improve education, awareness raising, and human and institutional capacity on climate change mitigation, adaptation, impact reduction, and early warning. Also, the implementation of the commitment undertaken by developed country parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, to a goal of mobilizing jointly $100 billion annually by 2020 from all sources to address the needs of developing countries in the context of meaningful mitigation actions and transparency on implementation and fully operationalization the Green Climate Fund through its capitalization as soon as possible. And promote mechanisms for raising capacity for effective climate change-related planning and management in least developed countries and small island developing states, including focusing, of course, on women, on youth, on local marginalized communities, and so on. This development goal now deals with the oceans, the life under the oceans, the issue of marine life conservation. And when we take a look on the left graph here, we can see that ocean acidity has increased by 26% since pre-industrial times, and it is expected to rapidly increase by 250% even by the year 2100, and that might have very detrimental effects. We can see that the proportion of fish stocks within biologically sustainable levels declined from 90% in the 1970s to 67% in the 2010s, so within 30 years, quite a tremendous effect, a tremendous decline. And we see on the other hand that now 70% of waters under national jurisdiction now are covered by protected areas, and more than double of the 2010 coverage level. So we can see something is done, but we can also see that it is very, very important to do something. And one step we can also see is that 87 countries signed the agreement on port state measures, which is the first binding international agreement on illegal, unreported and unregulated fishing. And we came across fishing when it was about hunger, when it was about getting decent jobs and so on. So again, here we can see a close relationship between the goals, and we have to be aware that the world's oceans, that can be the temperature, that can be the chemistry of them, the currents, the life within the oceans, they drive global systems that make Earth habitable for us human beings, for humankind. That is really, really important to understand, that the oceans of the world do have a crucial function, a significant role on our planet. Our rainwater, drinking water, weather, climate, coastlines, much of our food, and even the oxygen in the air we breathe are all ultimately provided and regulated by the sea. Throughout history, oceans and seas have been vital conduits for trade and transportation. Careful management of this really essential global resource is a key feature of sustainability, of a sustainable approach for the future. However, when we take a look now at the current time, there is a continuous deterioration of coastal waters owing to pollution and ocean acidification. That is having a tremendous adverse effect on the functioning of ecosystems and also with respect to biodiversity. This is also negatively impacting small-scale fisheries. Marine protected areas need to be efficiently managed and well-resourced, and regulations need to be put in place to reduce overfishing, marine pollution, and ocean acidification. You certainly know that oceans cover 3/4 of the Earth's surface. They contain 97% of the Earth's water and represent 99% of the living space on the planet by volume. Over 3 billion people depend on marine and coastal biodiversity for their livelihoods. Globally, the market value of marine and coastal resources and respective industries is estimated at about $3 trillion per year, which comes up to about 5% of the global GDP. Oceans contain nearly 200,000 identified species, but that is really a pretty small number as compared to assessments by biologists and so on. So the actual number probably is significantly higher, somewhere in several millions. Oceans absorb about 30% of carbon dioxide produced by humans, which is buffering the impacts of global warming, but of course not enough, as we heard. Oceans serve as the world's largest source of protein, with more than 3 billion people depending on the oceans as their primary source of protein. And we also can see from an economic standpoint that marine fisheries directly or indirectly employ over 200 million people. Another aspect is that subsidies for fishing are contributing to the rapid depletion of many fish species and are preventing efforts to save and restore global fisheries, and with that related jobs, causing ocean fisheries to generate $50 billion less per year than they could. So working short-sightedly causes already damage and will cause much more medium and long-term damage. Open ocean sites show current levels of acidity have increased, as we saw, by 26% since the start of the Industrial Revolution, and coastal waters are tremendously deteriorating due to pollution and eutrophication. Without concerted efforts, coastal eutrophication is expected to increase in 20% of large marine ecosystems by 2050. So what then are the specific targets of our goal number 14? By 2025, UN wants to prevent and significantly reduce marine pollution of all kinds, in particular from land-based activities, including marine debris and nutrient pollution. Also, the aim is to sustainably manage and protect marine and coastal ecosystems to avoid significant adverse impacts, including by strengthening their resilience and take action for their restoration in order to achieve healthy and productive oceans. To minimize and address the impacts of ocean acidification, including through enhanced scientific cooperation at all levels. Already by now, the aim is to effectively regulate harvesting and put an end to overfishing, to illegal, unreported and unregulated fishing and destructive fishing practices, and implement science-based management plans in order to restore fish stocks in the shortest time feasible, at least to levels that can produce maximum sustainable yield as determined by their biological characteristics. Also, by now, conserve at least 10% of coastal and marine areas, consistent with national and international law and based on the best available scientific information. Prohibit certain forms of fisheries subsidies which contribute to overcapacity and overfishing. Eliminate subsidies that contribute to illegal, unreported and unregulated fishing, and refrain from introducing new such subsidies, recognizing that appropriate and effective special and differential treatment for developing and least developed countries should be an integral part of the WTO fisheries subsidies negotiation. Also, an aim is to increase the economic benefits to small island developing states and least developed countries from the sustainable use of marine resources, including through sustainable management of fisheries, aquaculture and tourism. That basically are the measures. Also, the conservation and sustainable use of oceans and their resources by implementing international law as reflected in the UNCLOS, so the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Seas, which provides the legal framework for the conservation and sustainable use of oceans and their resources, as recalled in paragraph 158 of the Future We Want. So that is basically the plan for the ocean and marine conservation, and we will move on to the situation on the land, because the situation there is also problematic and needs to be addressed. So now we have reached the surface of the Earth again, and on the left hand side we see the red list index, which shows that biodiversity loss is happening, and it is happening even at an accelerated rate. The risk of species extinction has worsened by almost 10% over the last 25 years. So that is a highly problematic development, and I already mentioned that the loss of biodiversity has a lot of negative effects, even with respect to transferable diseases such as virus types of diseases, etc., but many other problematic things. And we also have one particular lecture which is dealing with biodiversity in more detail, but for now I still want to look somewhat more detailed into that issue of land and biodiversity protection, as is explained or announced through Sustainable Development Goal number 15. Land degradation, for example, is affecting 1/5 of the Earth's land area, and the lives of 1 billion people are affected there. We also see that the issue has been taken up. 116 parties have ratified the Nagoya Protocol, which addresses access to genetic resources and their fair and equitable use. We can see now that more of each key biodiversity is protected. So there are already some positive developments, but again, like in all the other ones, there is still a lot to be done. Let's look a little bit into the facts here. Forests currently cover more than 30% of the Earth's surface, and in addition to providing food security and also shelter, they are key to combating climate change, to protecting the biodiversity and the homes, also of course of the indigenous population. By protecting forests, we will also be able to strengthen natural resource management and increase land productivity. At the current time, and that is really a very bad situation, 13 million hectares of forests are being lost every year, while the persistent degradation of drylands has led to the desertification of 3.6 billion hectares. Even though up to 15% of land is currently under protection, biodiversity is still highly at risk. Deforestation and desertification caused by human activities and climate change, which again is at least to some part caused by human activities, pose major challenges to sustainable development, and they already have affected the lives and livelihoods of millions of people in the fight against poverty. Efforts are being made to manage forests and combat desertification. There are 2 international agreements being implemented currently that promote the use of resources in an equitable way. Financial investments in support of biodiversity are also provided. In June 2018, the UNDP, the United Nations Development Programme, Finch and founding partner Mars Incorporated announced the so-called Lion's Share Fund, an initiative aimed at transforming the lives of animals across the world by asking advertisers to contribute a percentage of their media spend to conservation and animal welfare projects. The Lion's Share will see partners contribute 0.5% of their media spend to the fund for each advertisement they use featuring an animal. Those funds will be used to support animals in their habitats around the world. The fund is seeking to raise $100 million a year within 3 years, with the money being invested in a range of wildlife conservation and animal welfare programs to be implemented by United Nations and civil society organization. Why is it important to address those issues? So we have to look maybe again at the forests, at desertification and biodiversity. At the moment, around 1.6 billion people depend on forests for their livelihood, including 7 million indigenous people. Forests are home to more than 80% of all terrestrial species of animals, plants and insects between 2010 and 2015. So the start of the last decade, so to say, to 5 years ago, the world lost 3.3 million hectares of forest areas. Poor rural people, particularly also poor rural women, depend on common pool resources and are especially affected by their depletion. And we look at the issue of desertification, we can see that 2.6 billion people depend directly on agriculture, but 52% of the land used for agriculture is moderately or severely affected by soil degradation. Arable land loss is estimated at 30 to 35 times the historical rate. Due to drought and desertification, 12 million hectares are lost each year. When we count that down, that is 23 hectares lost each and every minute. Just think how short a minute is, and think how big 23 hectares are each and every minute, every day, every hour, every week. Within 1 year, 20 million tons of grain could have been grown. 70% of the poor are directly affected by that land degradation which occurs around the globe. When we take a closer look to biodiversity, we will see that illicit poaching and trafficking of wildlife continues to thwart conservation efforts, with nearly 7,000 species of animals and plants reported in illegal trade involving 120 countries. Of the 8,300 animal breeds known, 8% are extinct and 22% are at risk of extinction. Of the over 80,000 tree species, less than 1% have been studied for potential use. Fish provide 20% of animal protein to about 3 billion people, as we heard. Only 10 species provide about 30% of marine capture fisheries, and 10 species provide about 50% of aquaculture production. Over 80% of the human diet is provided by plants. Only 3 cereal crops, rice, maize and wheat, provide 60% of energy intake. As many as 80% of people living in rural areas in developing countries rely on traditional plant-based medicines for basic health care. Microorganisms and invertebrates are key to ecosystem services, but their contributions are still poorly known and rarely acknowledged. On these backgrounds, the United Nations developed specific targets of this SDG number 15. By now, the UN wanted to ensure the conservation, restoration and sustainable use of terrestrial and inland freshwater ecosystems and their services, in particular forests, wetlands, mountains and drylands, in line with obligations under international agreements. Also promote the implementation of sustainable management of all types of forests, halt deforestation, restore degraded forests and substantially increase afforestation and reforestation globally. That should have been reached by 2020 by now, and when we take a look, for example, to Brazil or to parts of the US and to many other places in the world, we can see that that is not the case. When we look to the more long-term goals, that is the 2030 line, the UN is aiming at combating desertification, restoring degraded land and soil, including land affected by desertification, drought and floods, and striving to achieve a land degradation neutral world. Also, they're interested in ensuring the conservation of mountain ecosystems, including their biodiversity, in order to enhance their capacity to provide benefits that are essential for sustainable development. Also, they made clear that it is important to take urgent and significant action to reduce the degradation of natural habitats, halt the loss of biodiversity, and protect and prevent the extinction of threatened species as fast as possible. Furthermore, they want to promote fair and equitable sharing of the benefits arising from the utilization of genetic resources and promote appropriate access to such resources as already internationally agreed. Further, they warn that urgent action is needed to end poaching and trafficking of protected species of flora and fauna and address both demand and supply of illegal wildlife products. There is a number of further very detailed measures which are part of that goal, but I don't want to go into all of them too deeply, also for time reasons, but I think the issue has become pretty clear how important biodiversity is, how little we know about it, despite the fact that it's important, and how quickly we lost it and how dangerous it is. So that is something that shall stay in your mind. Our next social development goal, goal number 16, is the attainment of peaceful and inclusive societies. And we can see that societies around the world are not necessarily very peaceful. They're also not very inclusive. When we take a look here, men make up around 80% of homicide victims overall. Women constitute 64% of homicide victims of intimate partner or family-related homicide. So we see in different situations both genders are affected. 70% of detected victims of human trafficking are women and girls. So for women and girls, that is a very, very terrible situation. But at the same time, we can see that the persistence of crime, of organized crime, of transnational organized crime, also is something which is, of course, very much directed against the idea of a peaceful society. And again, here we see how security and development again come very closely together, and also because we deal here with issues of law, of good governance, etc. How important the sustainability, security, development cycle plays a role. So when we see the threats of international homicide, of violence against children, of human trafficking, sexual violence, etc., are important to address, to promote peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development. They pave the way for the provision of access to justice for all and to building effective, accountable institutions at all levels. While homicide and trafficking cases have been significantly addressed, we have seen significant progress there over the past decade, there are still thousands of people at great risk of intentional murder within Latin America, within Sub-Saharan Africa, within Asia. Children's rights violations through aggression and sexual violence continue to plague many countries around the world, especially as underreporting and a lack of data aggravate the problem. To tackle these challenges and build a more peaceful, build more inclusive societies, there needs to be more efficient and transparent regulations put in place, and comprehensive, realistic government budgets are also required. One of the first steps towards protecting individual rights is the implementation of worldwide birth registration, for example, and the creation of more independent national human rights institutions around the world. Among the institutions most affected by corruption on a global level, on a global average level, are the judiciary and the police. Corruption, bribery, theft, tax evasion, etc. cost about 1.26 trillion US dollars for developing countries each year. This amount of money could be used to lift those who are living on less than $1.25 a day above that rate for at least 6 years. So you can see how those practices harm the populations within the poor countries even further. And the bad thing is that it's personnel within these countries, its institutions within these countries, which play a huge role there. So there is a huge form of disrespect vis-a-vis the own citizens. So then we really have to think about what national interest is when the own citizens get betrayed in such proportion that they have to live under the poverty line. Birth registration has occurred for 73% of children under 5, but only 46% of sub-Saharan Africa have had their birth registered. Approximately 28.5 million primary school age who are out of school live in conflict areas. The rule of law and development have a significant interrelation and are mutually reinforcing, making it essential for sustainable development at the national and international level. The proportion of prisoners held in detention without sentencing has remained almost constant in the last decade at about 1/3 of all prisoners. We can take also a look at violence against children, just for example, because that is something United Nations is having a very close look on. Violence against children affects more than 1 billion children around the world and costs societies up to $7 trillion a year. 50% of the world's children experience violence every year. Every 5 minutes somewhere in the world a child is killed by violence. Even 1 in 10 children is sexually abused before the age of 18. 9 out of 10 children live in countries where corporal punishment is not prohibited, leaving 732 million children without respective legal protection. 1 in 3 internet users worldwide is a child, and 800 million of them use social media. Any child therefore can become a victim of online violence, and that requires capacities to awareness campaigns for children there. Child online sexual abuse reports to NCMEC has grown from 1 million in 2014 to 45 million in 2018. 246 million children worldwide are affected by school-related violence each year, and 1 in 3 students has been bullied by their peers at school in the last month, and at least 1 in 10 children have experienced also cyberbullying, that is bullying through the internet, for example. Given these facts, United Nations came up with specific targets in the context of SDG 16. namely to significantly reduce all forms of violence and related death rates everywhere, to end abuse, exploitation, trafficking, and all forms of violence against and torture of children, promote the rule of law at the national and international levels, and ensure equal access to justice for all. Also aimed at the significantly reduction of illicit financial and arms flows, the strengthening of the recovery and return of stolen assets, and the combat of all forms of organized crime, a substantial reduce in corruption and bribery in all the forms, the development of effective, accountable, and transparent institutions at all levels, the assurance of responsive, inclusive, participatory, and representative decision-making at all levels, the broadening and strengthening of the participation of developing countries in the institutions of global governance, and basically a strengthening of relevant national institutions, including through international cooperation for building capacity at all levels. And that, of course, is particularly something in developing countries. And that can be, for example, also to prevent violence, to combat terrorism, to combat crime, and so on. And finally, the promotion and enforcement of non-discriminatory laws and policies for sustainable development. To attain all these goals, and we have seen that they may be even unrealistically large, unrealistically high, but the idea is to score high, to really get something done, and we have seen how important it also is to address these issues, to tackle the problems, but no country is able to do it alone. So a successful sustainable development agenda requires partnerships between governments, between the private sector and civil society, between the stakeholders involved. These inclusive partnerships built upon principles and values are a shared vision, shared goals, etc., that place people and the planet at the center, are urgently needed at all levels, the global level, the regional levels, national level, the local level. Everywhere people, institutions have to work together and work for the good of all. Urgent action is needed to mobilize, redirect, and unlock the transformative power of trillions of dollars of private resources to deliver on sustainable development objectives. Long-term investments, including foreign direct investments, our famous FDIs, particularly the economists will know now what I'm talking about, are needed in critical sectors, especially in developing countries. These include sustainable energy, infrastructure and support, as well as IT, information and communication technologies. The public sector will need to set a clear direction in that context. Review and monitoring frameworks, regulations, and incentive structures that enable such investments must be retooled to attract investments and reinforce sustainable development. National oversight mechanisms such as supreme audit institutions and oversight functions by legislators should be strengthened. Those of you who also are currently in my methodology class have talked about with me over the issue of policy analysis and the policy cycle, etc. And that is basically exactly the processes which are done here, explaining policy change, instruments of policy change, etc. So those who are in both classes here in the EES and the research methodology, compare the lectures, think about it, think about how the policy cycle fits into the creation of sustainable policies. Yeah, what's the current situation? Official development assistance stood at $146.6 billion in 2017, representing a decrease of 0.6% in real terms as compared to the year before. 79% of imports from developing countries enter developed countries duty-free. The debt burden on developing countries remains stable at about 3% of export revenue. The number of internet users in Africa almost doubled in the past 4 years. 30% of the world's youth are digital natives, active online at least 5 years. But more, 4 billion people do not use the internet, and 90% of them are from the developing world. So what are the targets of the 17th Sustainable Development Goal? When we look to finance, the idea is to strengthen domestic resource mobilization, including through international support to developing countries to improve domestic capacity for tax and other revenue collection. Also, developed countries are to implement fully their official development assistance commitments, including the commitment by many developed countries to achieve the target of 0.7% of ODA GNI to developing countries and 0.15 to 0.20% of ODA GNI to least developed countries. ODA providers are encouraged to consider setting a target to provide at least 0.20% of ODE GNI to least developed countries. There is also the plan to mobilize additional financial resources for developing countries from multiple sources and also to assist developing countries in attaining long-term debt sustainability through coordinated policies aimed at fostering debt financing, debt relief, and debt restructuring as appropriate, and address the external debt of highly indebted poor countries to reduce debt distress. Finally, with respect to finance, the idea is to adopt and implement investment promotion regimes for LLDCs. When it comes to technology, the plan is to enhance North-South, South-South, and triangular regional and international cooperation on and access to science, technology, and innovation, and enhance knowledge sharing on mutually agreed terms, including through improved coordination among existing mechanisms, in particular at the UN level, and through a global technology facilitation mechanism. Also, the plan is to promote the development, transfer, dissemination, and diffusion of environmentally sound technologies to developing countries on favorable terms, including on concessional and preferential terms as mutually agreed. And finally, the plan to fully operationalize the technology bank and science, technology, and innovation capacity building mechanism for least developed countries, and the enhancement of the use of enabling technology, in particular information and communications technology. Also, capacity building is an issue here with the plan to enhance international support for implementing effective and targeted capacity building in developing countries to support national plans to implement all the Sustainable Development Goals, including through North-South, South-South, and triangular cooperation. And when it comes to trade, of course, one wants to promote a universal, rules-based, open, non-discriminatory, and equitable multilateral trading system under the WTO, including through the conclusion of negotiations under its Doha Development Agenda. Also, a significant increase in the exports of developing countries, in particular with a view to doubling the least developed countries' share of global exports by 2020 already. And then the plan to realize timely implementation of duty-free and quota-free market access on a lasting basis for all least developed countries, consistent with WTO decisions, including the ensuring that preferential rules of origin applicable to imports from least developed countries are transparent and simple and contribute to facilitating the markets. All in all, you can see now that the 17 goals aim high, and they aim at important things, but we don't know if they will be reached. But what we can already see is how far countries have gone. And the last slide, which is coming up after this one now, will give you a presentation by somebody who has worked deeply into the topic, into the statistics, and gives us an interesting point where we are currently standing in reaching the Sustainable Development Goals. And with that, I hand over, so to say, to the colleague here. And after you have watched that embedded video, I will come back with a short message and information on next week's lecture. If we had the chance now to sit together in class and talk about this video clip, that presentation of the colleague here, I definitely think we would have a really interesting discussion about it, also about the specific development goals we're talking about. Hopefully we will have this opportunity through the online systems. I sent you the email yesterday, so please try to get the Zoom software and we can try to use it to have a little discussion on those issues. I'm also ready to take your questions through email or through our Google Classroom system if you have any. And yes, please look into the topics of energy sustainability and water sustainability. Energy sustainability I already put for today. The videos, the video documentaries, and I think they, as long as you, if you already watched them, I think they were very interesting. If not, please try to do so, because they really are provide important insights into the issue. And I will also provide some particular video material on water sustainability, so that we are set then for next week. I will write down for you some minor tasks for preparation, etc. And that is also relevant, of course, with respect to our final grading. I already talked about that there might be changes to a 20/80 or a 0/100% with respect to classwork and final degree. Currently, Dr. Reham, as far as I learned, is trying to get a 50/50 solution. I already said that we will refrain from the final paper, but then we need some compensation for that, so that you can basically show that you week for week, week by week, were interested in following and adding to the knowledge, etc. So I will give you some further information on that in my next email. For now, thank you very much for listening to me, for going with me through the development goals. And I think now we have a very good basis for looking into next week's topics and the topics of the weeks to follow. Next week, as I said, energy and water sustainability. I'm very much looking forward to talking to you about these topics, discussing with you these issues, and I hope you have a good and interesting time dealing with these issues, preparing everything. And for you and your families, I wish you all the best. Stay safe, stay healthy, and inshallah we will continue and we will get out of that the sooner the better. Thank you very much for your attention. Bye bye. Ma salama.